In the summer of 1998, on what seemed like an ordinary day, a young Rick Sanchez made a discovery that would change the multiverse forever. Before the catchphrases, before the portal gun, before he became the Rick we know, there was just a brilliant scientist with a family he loved. That family, and what really happened to them, is the untold story I'll be revealing tonight. As you settle in and prepare for sleep, I'll walk through every confirmed fact and compelling theory about Rick's origin story, from his first invention to the formation of the Citadel of Ricks, all presented in a soothing chronological journey perfect for drifting off to. Long before Rick Sanchez became the cynical, universe-hopping genius we know today, he was just a kid with an unusual aptitude for science and a much different outlook on life. The seeds of his brilliant mind were planted early, but interestingly, the young Rick we can piece together from the show's scattered references bears little resemblance to the hardened alcoholic who burps his way through dimensions. In the Season 3 episode, The ABCs of Beth, we get our first real hint that Rick wasn't born cynical. While discussing Beth's childhood with her, Rick offhandedly mentions that he too went through a phase where he cared about things, suggesting his nihilism was a learned response rather than an innate trait. This brief comment opens a fascinating window into Rick's development. The idea that the universe's most jaded scientist once approached life with genuine enthusiasm. Bird Person, one of Rick's oldest friends, provides our most touching glimpse into Rick's childhood. In The Wedding Squanchers, he mentions a childhood pet Rick once had, a special companion whose death deeply affected young Rick. This revelation is particularly striking since it contradicts the emotional detachment Rick now prides himself on. The fact that Rick was once capable of such profound attachment to a pet suggests his current emotional walls were built over time, not present from birth. Rick's early education appears to have been as unconventional as the man himself. Several episodes contain blink and you'll miss it references to his schooling, with the most telling coming in The Rick Shank Redemption, where Rick mentions the academy during one of his fabricated memories. While this specific memory was fake, later canonical information suggests Rick did indeed attend some form of prestigious scientific institution in his youth. What's particularly interesting is that he apparently didn't complete his formal education, with Rick Mirai Jack containing a brief reference to Rick leaving school after conflicts with authority figures, an early manifestation of his lifelong problem with institutions. Unlike the weapons and destructive devices that define his current arsenal, young Rick's inventions appeared to focus more on exploration and discovery. In Morty's Mind Blowers, we briefly see a memory where Rick mentions his first science fair, creating what he describes as just a simple interdimensional radio. This casual reference is quite revealing. What Rick considers a simple childhood project would be a revolutionary device by our standards, indicating just how early his exceptional abilities manifested. Rick's relationship with his parents remains one of the most mysterious aspects of his backstory. The show has deliberately kept information about Rick's parents sparse, though what little we do know paints a complicated picture. In the episode The Old Man in the Seat, Rick makes a passing reference to his father while discussing toilet privacy, suggesting a strained relationship that contributed to Rick's issues with boundaries. This vague comment hints at a troubled dynamic that likely shaped Rick's fierce independence and resistance to authority. What's particularly fascinating is that despite his extraordinary intelligence, Rick appears to have experienced a relatively normal childhood emotionally. In Star Mort Rick Turn of the Jerry, Rick's brain is scanned, revealing glimpses of childhood memories that show him experiencing typical childhood emotions: wonder, curiosity, disappointment, and joy. These fleeting images suggest that Rick's current emotional suppression isn't his natural state, but rather a defense mechanism built up over decades of trauma. The timeline of Rick's development suggests his scientific genius fully crystallized in his late teens, around the time he first became seriously interested in interdimensional theory. Season 5's Rickternal Friendshine of the Spotless Mort gives us our clearest reference point, showing through Bird Person's memories that Rick had already developed impressive technological capabilities by his early 20s. This indicates that the critical period for Rick's scientific development would have been his late adolescence, when his natural brilliance combined with increasingly sophisticated knowledge. One of the most surprising aspects of young Rick's character is his apparent idealism. In Ricksy Business, when Bird Person translates Rick's catchphrase, "Wubba lubba dub dub," as meaning, "I am in great pain, please help me," he notes that Rick began using it during their revolutionary days. This suggests that at one point, Rick cared enough about freedom and justice to fight for a cause, a far cry from his current philosophy that nothing matters in an infinite multiverse. What's particularly telling is how Rick's childhood experiences with discovery and invention shaped his relationship with science itself. In the Ricklantis Mix-Up, one of the many Rick variants mentions how he originally got into science for the right reasons, before becoming jaded. This throwaway line supports the idea that young Rick approached science with genuine wonder and curiosity, rather than as a tool for power or escape. His childhood relationship with science appears to have been pure and uncorrupted by the traumas that would later define him. Perhaps most importantly, Rick's childhood established the foundation of his genius, but lacked the defining traumas that would later break him. The Rick we meet in the pilot episode is already deeply scarred by experiences we'll explore later: the murder of his wife, his failed revenge quest, and decades of wandering the multiverse. But the child Rick once was, brilliant, emotionally open, and even idealistic, suggests these traumatic experiences fundamentally altered his character rather than merely enhancing traits that were always there. Before Rick's heart was hardened by those defining traumas, there was Diane, the one person who understood the brilliant, emotionally vulnerable scientist behind the cynical facade we know today. Their relationship remains one of the show's most carefully guarded secrets, with the writers deliberately keeping their love story shrouded in mystery. But the fragments we've seen across 7 seasons paint a picture that contradicts many fan theories and reveals something surprisingly ordinary yet profound about the universe's most guarded scientist. The show has been remarkably strategic about how it reveals information about Diane Sanchez. In Season 3's The Rick Shank Redemption, Rick appeared to fabricate a memory of meeting Diane, making fans question whether she even existed. He showed a seemingly idyllic scene where a young Rick was approached by another Rick offering him interdimensional travel technology, which he refused because of his happy life with Diane and baby Beth. The memory ended with their violent deaths by bomb, but Rick later claimed this was completely fabricated to trick his captors. This initial portrayal led many viewers to believe Diane might have been entirely invented, a convenient backstory Rick created to manipulate others. However, subsequent seasons carefully dismantled this theory. Season 5's finale, Rick Mirai Jack, provided definitive confirmation that Diane was indeed Rick's wife across multiple dimensions, and that their relationship was genuinely loving. This revelation directly contradicted fan theories that their marriage was some kind of scientific experiment or manipulation on Rick's part. What's particularly fascinating about their relationship is how it challenges our understanding of Rick's capacity for human connection. The glimpses we've seen suggest that with Diane, Rick was capable of genuine emotional vulnerability and commitment, qualities that seem almost alien when we look at the cynical, detached Rick from the series' beginning. Their relationship appears to represent a period when Rick was still capable of the very connections he now dismisses as meaningless in an infinite multiverse. Their courtship seems to have occurred during Rick's early scientific career, likely after he had already begun developing some of his impressive technological capabilities, but before he'd perfected his signature portal technology. The timing is significant. Diane knew and fell in love with Rick when he was already an exceptional scientific mind, but before the traumatic experiences that would reshape his personality. She loved the genius without having to contend with the full weight of his cynicism and emotional detachment. Season 7 added an intriguing new dimension to our understanding of Diane by referencing her thesis, suggesting she may have had a scientific background herself. This would explain part of their connection. Diane could understand Rick's work in a way few others could, making her not just emotional support, but an intellectual partner. Their relationship wasn't just about Rick finding someone who tolerated his scientific obsessions. It was about finding someone who could meaningfully engage with them. Perhaps the most compelling aspect of their relationship is how Diane seems to have balanced Rick's more extreme tendencies. The evidence suggests she served dual roles, providing emotional stability while also challenging his thinking and keeping his growing ego in check. In a sense, she was the perfect counterbalance to Rick's personality, providing exactly what he needed before he became the man who claims to need nothing and no one. The timeline of their relationship indicates they were married for several years before having Beth, living what appears to have been a relatively normal domestic life, despite Rick's increasingly ambitious scientific work. This period of domestic stability reveals a Rick who somehow managed to reconcile his scientific genius with ordinary human connections, a balance he would never achieve again after losing Diane. Their home life seems to have been both ordinary and extraordinary. On one hand, they appeared to have a conventional marriage with the usual milestones: a home, a child, family routines. On the other hand, Rick was already developing technology far beyond anything on Earth. Diane apparently accepted this duality, embracing both the mundane aspects of their life together and the exceptional nature of Rick's mind. This chapter of Rick's life stands in stark contrast to everything that would follow. The relationship with Diane represents the most human period of Rick's existence, a time when he experienced genuine happiness and connection before trauma and loss turned him into the hardened, nihilistic character we meet in the pilot episode. Understanding Rick and Diane's relationship helps us understand the magnitude of what Rick lost when she was killed. Not just a wife, but his anchor to humanity itself. What makes their love story particularly poignant is how it defies the cynical philosophy Rick espouses throughout the series. Rick constantly insists that nothing matters in an infinite multiverse, that attachments are meaningless when there are infinite versions of everyone. Yet his decades-long revenge quest after Diane's death proves that some connections transcend even Rick's multiverse philosophy. Despite infinite Dianes existing across the multiverse, Rick never sought to replace his Diane, suggesting their bond was truly singular in his mind. The scattered clues about their relationship also help explain why Rick chose to live with a version of Beth who wasn't his original daughter. Having experienced genuine love with Diane and having failed to protect her, Rick's complicated relationship with Beth makes more emotional sense. She represents both a connection to the happiness he once had and a painful reminder of his greatest failure. Rick's complicated feelings toward Beth as an adult have their roots in a far more nurturing beginning than most fans realize. The same scientific genius who later abandoned his family once channeled his brilliance into creating Fruppyland, an entire dimension designed specifically for his young daughter's imagination and safety. This extraordinary creation wasn't just a playground. It was a testament to the lengths Rick would go to for his child, revealing a side of him we rarely glimpse in the cynical, detached scientist of later years. Fruppyland stands as perhaps the most tangible evidence of Rick's dedication as a father. This wasn't just any ordinary playset or even a high-tech toy. This was an entire pocket dimension with its own physics, ecosystems, and safety features. In The ABCs of Beth, we learn that Rick specifically engineered this place with Beth's protection in mind, creating buoyant, non-toxic rainbow rivers and sentient, friendly creatures that couldn't be killed. The sheer scale of this undertaking demonstrates a level of parental devotion that seems almost inconceivable from the Rick we know in the present timeline. Yet even in this act of fatherly love, we see the seeds of the danger that would come to define Rick's creations. The case of Tommy, not a toy as Beth remembered, but actually a neighborhood child who became trapped in Fruppyland, reveals the unintended consequences of Rick's genius, even in his most benevolent inventions. Despite designing the dimension with safety protocols, Rick couldn't anticipate every possibility, especially when combined with what appears to have been Beth's own troubled tendencies as a child. This incident foreshadows how Rick's scientific brilliance, even when applied with good intentions, often created chaos and destruction. What's particularly fascinating about Rick's early fatherhood is how he seems to have recognized and nurtured Beth's own scientific aptitude. Several episodes hint that Rick saw genuine potential in his daughter, treating her as a budding scientific protege rather than just a child to be entertained. This recognition of Beth's intelligence suggests Rick wasn't merely creating distractions to keep her occupied. He was actively encouraging the same curiosity and problem-solving skills that defined his own scientific journey. The timeline pieced together from various episodes indicates that Rick was an active presence in Beth's life for approximately the first 5 to 7 years. This period of attachment and bonding becomes crucial for understanding the psychological dynamics we see play out between them as adults. Beth's formative years included having a father who, while unconventional, was demonstrably present and engaged in her development. This makes the subsequent abandonment all the more traumatic. Not just the absence of a parent, but the sudden vanishing of a specific type of intellectual and emotional connection Beth had come to depend on. This early relationship also helps explain the contradictory nature of Beth's adult feelings toward Rick. Her simultaneous resentment of his abandonment and desperate seeking of his approval make emotional sense when we understand she experienced enough positive attention in those early years to know what she was missing during his long absence. Unlike someone who never had a father figure at all, Beth had experienced both having and losing that connection, creating the complex emotional tangle we witness in her adult personality. The contrast between Rick's early fatherhood and his later behavior raises profound questions about his character development. What could transform someone who would create an entire dimension for his child's happiness into the emotionally distant, often cruel figure we meet in the series' present? The answer lies in understanding that Rick's early fatherhood represents a time before the central trauma that would reshape his entire worldview, before the death of Diane and his original Beth at the hands of Rick Prime. While Fruppyland stands as the most elaborate example of Rick's parental devotion, smaller moments scattered throughout the series reinforce this picture of a once-engaged father. Beth's scientific proficiency as an adult horse surgeon, her comfort with advanced technology, and her ability to understand some of Rick's scientific concepts all suggest early exposure to these ideas. Though she didn't follow directly in his footsteps, the scientific mindset Rick cultivated in Beth remained a part of her identity even during his long absence. This early period of fatherhood also offers a window into what Rick values beyond science itself. The care put into Fruppyland's design reveals a father who wanted his daughter to experience wonder, imagination, and safety simultaneously, suggesting Rick once believed joy and security were worth investing his genius to preserve. This stands in stark contrast to the nihilistic Rick, who consistently claims nothing matters in an infinite multiverse. In these early years, Beth clearly mattered enough for Rick to create entire worlds for her benefit. The limited time frame of Rick's active fatherhood, those 5 to 7 years before tragedy struck, adds another layer of poignancy to their relationship. Beth experienced just enough of her father's presence to form strong attachment bonds, but not enough to fully internalize his love as unconditional. This partial foundation helps explain why adult Beth remains so vulnerable to Rick's approval or criticism. The attachment was real but incomplete, creating a persistent emotional need that was never fully resolved. Even in this relatively happy period, however, there are hints of the darkness to come. Rick's inventions, while meant to protect and entertain Beth, already contained inherent dangers. The Tommy incident demonstrates how the same brilliance that could create wonders could also, even unintentionally, cause harm. This duality in Rick's creations would only grow more pronounced as his experiences grew more traumatic, eventually leading to the weapons and devices that define his later adventures. The picture that emerges of Rick as a young father is one of genuine love expressed through his scientific genius, a man who hadn't yet developed the emotional walls and nihilistic philosophy that would later define him. He created worlds for his daughter, recognized her intelligence, and actively participated in her development. This makes the stark contrast with the Rick we meet in the series all the more dramatic, highlighting just how profoundly the upcoming tragedy would transform him. Behind Rick's cynical exterior lies a wound deeper than abandonment: the complete erasure of his family by someone wearing his own face. For years, fans were led to believe that Rick's family tragedy was possibly fabricated, a convenient story to manipulate his enemies. But as the series progressed, we learned that not only was the tragedy real, it was far more sinister than initially presented. In Season 5's finale, Rick Mirai Jack, we finally received confirmation of what actually happened on that fateful night. Rick's wife and daughter weren't killed by random alien attackers, as briefly shown in that Season 3 memory. The truth is much darker. They were murdered by another version of Rick, specifically the one known as Rick Prime. This revelation fundamentally changes our understanding of Rick C-137's motivations and emotional scars. The attack happened during a critical period in Rick's scientific development. He had begun exploring portal technology but hadn't yet mastered it. This timing is significant because it suggests Rick was just starting to collaborate with other versions of himself across dimensions. He was still firmly rooted in his home dimension, prioritizing his family life with Diane and young Beth, while simultaneously pursuing scientific breakthroughs. What makes this betrayal even more devastating is that it wasn't random chance. Rick Prime deliberately targeted Rick C-137's family. According to what we learn in Rick Mirai Jack, Rick C-137 had refused to abandon his family for interdimensional adventures. While other Ricks across the multiverse were willing to leave their Beths and Dianes behind to pursue science without emotional attachments, our Rick chose family. This refusal apparently threatened Rick Prime's worldview enough that he decided to eliminate C-137's family entirely. Season 6's Solarix episode revealed an even more horrifying dimension to this attack. Rick Prime didn't just kill Diane in one reality, he deployed something called the Omega device that effectively erased her from every universe in the multiverse. This is a level of villainy beyond simple murder. It's a calculated multiversal genocide specifically targeting the woman Rick loved. It explains why Rick never simply sought out another Diane in the infinite multiverse. There were none left to find. The methodical nature of Rick Prime's attack speaks volumes about his character. In Season 7's Unmortricken, we see that despite his intelligence and ruthlessness, Rick Prime is fundamentally a coward. He preferred to attack C-137's family from a distance rather than confront his alternate self directly. This cowardice becomes a defining character trait of Rick Prime. He's willing to destroy lives, but unwilling to face the consequences of his actions. The contrast between Rick Prime's approach and C-137's subsequent face-to-face revenge quest highlights the fundamental differences between these. Two versions of the same man. After losing his family, Rick C-137 made a decision that would define the rest of the series. He abandoned his original dimension. This explains one of the show's central mysteries: why Rick lives with a Beth who isn't technically his daughter. The Beth we know throughout the series is from a different dimension, one where her original Rick, ironically, Rick Prime himself, abandoned her rather than seeing her die. This creates a complex emotional dynamic where Rick is simultaneously trying to reconnect with a daughter he lost and hunting the man who both killed his original family and abandoned this new Beth. The murder of Diane and Beth represents the pivotal moment in Rick's character development, the inflection point that transformed him from the loving father and husband we glimpsed in earlier episodes into the cynical, nihilistic alcoholic introduced in Season 1. Every bitter comment, every dismissal of emotional attachment, every self-destructive behavior can be traced back to this single traumatic event. This tragedy didn't just break Rick emotionally, it fundamentally altered his relationship with the entire multiverse. Before Diane's death, Rick was exploring the multiverse with wonder and scientific curiosity. After the tragedy, the infinite possibilities of reality became a curse rather than a blessing. In a multiverse where everything is possible and nothing is unique, Rick lost the only thing that actually mattered to him: his specific family, from his specific reality. The impact of this loss extends far beyond Rick's personal journey. His subsequent revenge quest would reshape the structure of the multiverse itself. His hunt for Rick Prime caused such destruction that it forced other Ricks to band together for protection, ultimately leading to the creation of the Citadel of Ricks. Even the central finite curve, the walled-off section of the multiverse where Rick is always the smartest being, can be traced back to this initial act of violence. It's worth noting that Rick never shared the full truth about his family's death with anyone until very late in the series. For decades, he carried this burden alone, allowing others, including viewers, to believe simpler or more convenient versions of his backstory. This secrecy speaks to both his inability to process the trauma and his strategic mind, knowing that revealing his true motivations might make him vulnerable. What's particularly poignant about this tragedy is how it forced Rick into becoming more like the man he hated. In his quest for vengeance against Rick Prime, Rick C-137 had to adopt many of the same traits: detachment from family, willingness to destroy other realities, and a single-minded focus on his own goals above all else. The revenge consumed him so completely that even after finally killing Rick Prime in Season 7, he was left hollow, unsure of who he was without his defining quest. While most people would seek therapy after a devastating loss, Rick C-137 chose a different path, methodically executing every version of himself he could find until he located his family's killer. This decades-long murder spree wasn't just shocking in its brutality. It fundamentally transformed the political landscape of the multiverse, creating the very institution Rick would come to hate most. When Rick C-137 began his hunt for Rick Prime, he wasn't just a grieving husband and father. He became an avenging force that struck terror into the hearts of Ricks across dimensions. For somewhere between 15 and 20 years, he perfected the art of Rick hunting. Each encounter followed a similar pattern. Track down a Rick, violently apprehend him, interrogate him about Rick Prime's whereabouts, and then execute him when he inevitably couldn't provide useful information. This wasn't random violence. It was calculated. Rick developed a systematic approach to his revenge, treating it almost like a scientific experiment. With each Rick he interrogated and killed, he gathered more data, slowly narrowing down the possible locations where Rick Prime might be hiding. The search became his singular purpose, and he devoted all his considerable intellect to this grim task. During this period, he refined his portal technology to unprecedented levels, allowing him to move between dimensions more efficiently than any other Rick. He also developed many of the signature weapons we now associate with him, turning himself into a one-man army. But the toll of this quest was enormous. With each failed attempt to locate Rick Prime, Rick C-137 sank deeper into despair. This is when his alcoholism began to take root. What started as a coping mechanism gradually became a defining characteristic. The bottle became his constant companion as he jumped from dimension to dimension, leaving bodies in his wake. His nihilistic worldview also crystallized during this time. When you've seen countless versions of yourself and killed most of them, it becomes difficult to believe in meaning or purpose. What's fascinating about this period is how it transformed Rick from victim to villain in the eyes of his other selves. Across the multiverse, the name Rick C-137 became synonymous with death. Other Ricks began to whisper about the Rick Hunter, or the Rickest Rick, a boogeyman version of themselves who could appear at any moment through a portal and end their existence. Imagine the psychological impact of knowing you're being hunted by yourself, by a version of you who knows exactly how you think. The situation eventually became so dire that the surviving Ricks realized they couldn't defeat C-137 individually. In perhaps the most ironic twist in Rick's story, these independent, egotistical scientists were forced to do something entirely against their nature: cooperate. They banded together specifically to defend themselves against Rick C-137, forming what would eventually become the Citadel of Ricks. This is a crucial point in understanding Rick's character. The Citadel, that bureaucratic conformist organization that Rick despises throughout the series, exists because other Ricks were terrified of him. His revenge quest was so thorough, so devastating, that it forced thousands of the most independently minded beings in the multiverse to create a government just to feel safe. When we see Rick rolling his eyes at Citadel politics in later episodes, we're watching a man scoff at an institution that exists largely because of his own actions. The formation of the Citadel marked the end of Rick's most active hunting phase. With countless Ricks now working together, continuing his previous approach became impossible. Yet even this massive alliance couldn't actually capture or kill C-137. Instead, they reached a kind of uneasy truce. The Citadel would help Rick in his search for Rick Prime, providing intelligence and resources, while Rick would end his indiscriminate killing of other Ricks. This compromise was deeply unsatisfying for Rick. Not only had he failed to find his family's killer, but he now found himself reluctantly associated with an organization that embodied everything he stood against: conformity, bureaucracy, and the abandonment of individuality. The Ricks of the Citadel represented the very qualities that had led Rick Prime to abandon his family in the first place: the belief that Ricks were too special to be tied down by family connections. In forming the Citadel, the other Ricks essentially proved Rick Prime right and Rick C-137 wrong. They chose to create a society of Ricks rather than return to their families. This is why Rick's hatred of the Citadel runs so deep. It's not just annoyance at bureaucracy, but a fundamental rejection of their shared values. What makes this chapter of Rick's life so compelling is how it shaped both his powers and his personality. The skills he developed hunting other Ricks, the portal gun refinements, the combat abilities, the strategic thinking, would later serve him well in his adventures with Morty. But the psychological damage was immense. Having lost his original family, then spent decades in a futile revenge quest, then inadvertently created an institution he despised, Rick was left more broken than ever. His encounters with other Ricks also forced him to confront uncomfortable truths about himself. With each Rick he interrogated and killed, he was confronting a version of himself, seeing how easily he could have become Rick Prime under different circumstances. This deepened his self-loathing while also reinforcing his belief that he was somehow different, the Rickest Rick, more principled and more devoted to family than his counterparts, even as his actions grew increasingly similar to the very Rick he was hunting. The Galactic Federation had their own name for Rick, C-137, terrorist, revolutionary, freedom fighter. Between murdering countless versions of himself and becoming the man we know today, Rick's life took a paradoxical detour into genuine heroism. What could possibly drive a man who believes nothing matters to risk his life fighting an intergalactic empire? The answer lies in two unlikely friendships forged in the crucible of rebellion. After the devastating loss of his family and years spent hunting Rick Prime, C-137 found himself adrift in a universe that seemed increasingly pointless. Yet somehow, in this darkest chapter, Rick aligned himself with a cause bigger than his personal vendetta, a resistance movement against the oppressive Galactic Federation. This surprising turn toward collective action rather than solitary revenge shows an unexpected dimension to Rick's character evolution. The resistance brought Rick into contact with the two beings who would become his closest allies, Bird Person and Squanchy. While we first meet these characters in Season 2's Get Schwifty, their history with Rick stretches back decades to a time when the three fought side by side against Federation forces. What's fascinating about these relationships is how they contradicted Rick's professed philosophy that attachments are meaningless in an infinite multiverse. The Blood Ridge battle, referenced throughout multiple episodes, marked a watershed moment for both the rebellion and Rick personally. This wasn't just another skirmish, but a defining conflict where Rick proved himself not only as a scientific genius, but as a strategic revolutionary. Federation records likely documented the battle as a devastating defeat, with Rick's improvised weaponry turning their own technology against them. What they couldn't record was how this shared trauma cemented bonds between the three fighters that would last decades. Rick's technological innovations during this period weren't purely for personal survival anymore. He adapted and repurposed Federation tech into weapons and defenses for the Resistance fighters. His portal gun, originally perfected during his hunt for Rick Prime, became an invaluable tactical advantage, allowing rebels to strike and disappear before Federation forces could respond. This era gave birth to many of Rick's signature inventions, developed under the pressure of guerrilla warfare rather than in the comparative safety of a garage lab. What's particularly revealing about this period is how Rick's famous catchphrase originated. When Bird Person translates "Wooba Looba Dub Dub" in his native language as "I am in great pain, please help me," we glimpse the profound suffering behind Rick's flippant exterior. This wasn't just a meaningless party phrase, but a coded cry for help that only his closest companions would understand. A rare admission of vulnerability from someone who typically presents himself as emotionally impenetrable. Season 5's Rickternal Friendshine of the Spotless Mort offers our most intimate look at this era, particularly through Rick's relationship with Bird Person. Their friendship wasn't based on convenience or utility, but on genuine mutual respect and even affection. When Rick entered Bird Person's consciousness to restore his memories, we saw flashbacks of their shared battles, late-night philosophical discussions, and surprisingly tender moments of connection. For a man who claims emotional attachments are meaningless, Rick invested extraordinary effort in maintaining this friendship across decades. The contrast between Rick's nihilistic statements and his actions during the rebellion reveals a fascinating contradiction. While verbally dismissing the concept of fighting for ideals, he nonetheless risked his life repeatedly for the Resistance cause. Perhaps the adrenaline of battle provided temporary relief from his grief. Or maybe the structured purpose of rebellion offered an organizing principle for a life otherwise defined by chaos. Either way, Rick found himself engaging in precisely the kind of idealistic struggle he would later mock. Squanchy complemented this trio with his berserker fighting style and unwaveringly loyal nature. Despite his diminutive appearance, Squanchy's transformation abilities made him a formidable ally in combat. The friendship between these three wasn't just functional. They celebrated together between missions, performed music as the Flesh Curtains, and developed the kind of shorthand communication that only comes from trusting someone with your life repeatedly. These relationships offered Rick something he desperately needed after losing his family: connection without the vulnerability of starting over with new human attachments. Bird Person and Squanchy weren't replacements for Diane and Beth, but they provided companionship that acknowledged rather than ignored Rick's pain. When Bird Person states in a later episode that he and Rick fought side by side against the Galactic Federation, the simple sentence carries the weight of countless unspoken experiences. The Federation's perspective on Rick during this time is equally telling. To them, he wasn't just another rebel, but a high-value target, the unpredictable genius whose technological innovations repeatedly turned the tide of battles. Federation records likely labeled him with escalating threat designations as his legend grew. What began as a personal vendetta against Rick Prime had evolved into a reputation as the Federation's most wanted revolutionary. Yet for all the purpose and connection the rebellion provided, it ultimately couldn't heal Rick's fundamental wound. Between firefights and strategic planning sessions, he remained the broken man whose family had been murdered. His alcohol consumption, already problematic during his hunt for Rick Prime, became further entrenched during this period. Battlefield victories offered momentary satisfaction but no lasting peace. Eventually, this chapter of Rick's life would also end in tragedy. While the series hasn't explicitly shown what fractured the resistance movement, hints suggest the Federation eventually gained the upper hand, forcing the rebels to scatter. Bird Person retreated to his solitary existence, and Squanchy went underground. The defeat of the resistance movement represented another failure for Rick. Further evidence that fighting for something meaningful ultimately leads to disappointment. This period reveals perhaps the most surprising aspect of Rick's character: his capacity for temporary idealism, even amid overwhelming cynicism. Despite knowing the mathematical certainty that, in an infinite multiverse, their rebellion was simultaneously succeeding and failing across countless dimensions, Rick chose to fight anyway. This paradoxical commitment to a cause while maintaining intellectual detachment from its outcome defines Rick's unique philosophical position. When the revolution collapsed and his comrades scattered to the cosmic winds, Rick C-137 entered what might be the darkest chapter of his existence. 2 full decades where the smartest man in the universe had no purpose at all. With his family murdered, his revenge quest stalled, and his revolutionary cause defeated, Rick drifted aimlessly through the infinite expanse of the multiverse. It's telling that these 20 years remain largely undocumented in the main storyline, with only fragments revealed through flashbacks and offhand comments. These lost decades weren't empty calendar pages, though. They were the crucible that forged the cynical, alcoholic grandfather who would eventually crash into Beth Smith's life. Without the structure of either family or rebellion, Rick's behaviors became increasingly erratic and self-destructive. The alcoholism that had begun during his revenge quest evolved from occasional coping mechanism to defining characteristic. Rick's substance abuse expanded beyond alcohol too. His travels exposed him to every conceivable intoxicant across thousands of dimensions. This period marks the beginning of Rick's habit of conducting scientific experiments while heavily intoxicated, a practice that would later become his trademark. Perhaps the most significant relationship from this wandering period was with Unity, the hive mind we meet in Season 2's autoerotic assimilation. Their romance stands as one of Rick's few meaningful connections during these lost years. What makes the Unity relationship particularly revealing is how it ended, not because Unity didn't care for Rick, but because she recognized his destructive influence. In her goodbye letter, Unity wrote that Rick makes people the worst versions of themselves. This speaks volumes about Rick's state during this period. He had become so consumed by his own pain that he actively corrupted those around him. Rick's experiences with Heistatron during this time shed light on another aspect of his wandering years. In Season 4's One Crew Over the Cuckoo's Morty, we learn that Rick's hatred of heist movies stemmed from an encounter with his own creation, Heistatron, who betrayed him. This reveals an important pattern. Rick repeatedly created companions or systems to give his life structure, only to have them either betray him or be abandoned by his own hand. This cycle reinforced his growing belief that meaningful connection was impossible in an infinite universe. The multiverse itself became both Rick's playground and prison during these decades. Without any fixed home or relationships, he bounced between dimensions, sometimes staying for weeks or years before inevitably moving on. Several episodes hint that Rick attempted to settle down multiple times during these years. He would find a community or even an individual who offered some comfort, establish a tenuous connection, then inevitably sabotage it. This wasn't simply bad luck. It was active self-sabotage stemming from his inability to form lasting attachments after the tragedy of losing Diane. One of the most intriguing aspects of Rick's wandering years is how his scientific development continued despite his emotional deterioration. Freed from both ethical constraints and institutional oversight, Rick's technological innovations accelerated dramatically. Many of his most dangerous inventions date from this period. Devices too horrific to create during his family years, or too impractical for the focused requirements of revolution. With no purpose beyond his own whims, Rick's genius had no guardrails. The multiverse became his laboratory, and everything in it his potential test subject. Each dimension Rick visited added another layer to his complex philosophy. He encountered societies that worshipped him as a god, dimensions where mathematics functioned differently, and universes where time flowed backward. He witnessed technological utopias and post-apocalyptic wastelands. He saw every possible outcome for humanity and countless alien civilizations. The cumulative effect of these experiences wasn't wisdom or perspective. It was a deep, unshakable nihilism. If everything that could happen did happen somewhere in the multiverse, what was the point of any individual choice or action? Rick's experiences during this time fundamentally altered his view of reality itself. Prior to his wandering years, Rick had understood the multiverse intellectually, but still maintained some belief in the significance of individual choice. After witnessing thousands of dimensional variations, this belief collapsed entirely. The mathematical certainty that everything was simultaneously succeeding and failing across infinite dimensions destroyed his capacity for hope. What emerged was the philosophical framework he would later express to Morty. The belief that nothing matters, that the universe is random chaos, and that the only logical response is to pursue momentary pleasure. It's during these lost decades that Rick honed his self-destructive habits into something resembling a lifestyle. His distinctive burping speech pattern, which had begun during his revenge quest, became more pronounced as his alcoholism worsened. His personal hygiene deteriorated, and his concern for his own safety disappeared almost entirely. The Rick who emerges from these 2 decades is physically and emotionally transformed, older, more weathered, and fundamentally broken in ways that even his genius couldn't repair. The wandering years also saw Rick develop his talent for improvisation to unparalleled levels. Without a home base or consistent resources, he became adept at creating complex technology from whatever materials were available. This skill would later serve him well during adventures with Morty, allowing him to escape seemingly impossible situations with minimal resources. Rick's experiences during this period made him uniquely adaptable. There was no environment so alien that he couldn't quickly assess and manipulate it to his advantage. What remains most mysterious about these 2 decades is what finally prompted Rick to seek out Beth. After years of aimless wandering, something drove him to find a version of his daughter and attempt to establish some kind of familial connection. Was it a moment of clarity, a near-death experience, or simply the gradual weight of loneliness? The show has never explicitly answered this question, leaving it as one of the most intriguing gaps in Rick's timeline. That moment when Rick appeared at Beth's doorstep wasn't the heartwarming family reunion it seemed. after decades of wandering alone. The answer to what brought Rick to the Smiths' doorstep wasn't love or sentimentality. It was cold, calculated strategy. What appeared to be a grandfather simply reconnecting with his daughter was actually an elaborate trap laid for his greatest enemy, with an innocent family caught in the crossfire. When Rick C-137 showed up at Beth Smith's door, he wasn't just looking for any version of his daughter. He specifically sought out a Beth who had a teenage son named Morty. This wasn't coincidence, but a deliberate choice made for multiple strategic reasons. After spending 20 years searching the multiverse, Rick had identified the Smith family as the original family of Rick Prime, the very same Rick who had murdered his wife and daughter decades earlier. By inserting himself into this family, Rick was effectively setting up a stakeout, anticipating that Rick Prime might eventually return to his original dimension. Season 1 established that when Rick arrived, he had been absent from Beth's life for exactly 20 years. We see Beth welcoming her father back with open arms, desperate for his approval and acceptance. Jerry, however, viewed Rick's sudden appearance with suspicion from the beginning, a rare instance where Jerry's paranoia was actually justified, though not for the reasons he believed. What Jerry interpreted as Rick being a bad influence was actually something far more calculated. Rick was using the family as both cover and bait. The relationship between Rick and this alternate Beth is fascinating because of its inherent complications. This Beth isn't his biological daughter. She's the daughter of the man who murdered his actual family. Yet Rick develops genuine affection for her, creating a strange dynamic where he simultaneously uses her family for strategic purposes while also forming real attachments. The timeline creates an unusual scenario where Rick is building a relationship with the adult version of a daughter figure he never got to see grow up, as his original Beth died as a child. But the most crucial factor in Rick's decision wasn't Beth at all. It was Morty. In Close Rick Counters of the Rick kind, we learn that Mortys have a unique neurological trait. They emit specific brainwaves that perfectly mask the brainwaves of Rick's. This makes a Morty the perfect camouflage for a Rick trying to hide from detection, especially from other Ricks. The brilliant scientist didn't just want a family. He needed a teenage grandson with specific brainwave patterns to shield himself while he waited for his nemesis. When Rick moved into the Smith household, he established it as his primary dimension, designation C-131. This wasn't just a random choice, but a strategic designation after losing his original C-137 dimension when his family was murdered. The Smith residence became Rick's first stable home in decades, a base of operations from which he could conduct his continued search for Rick Prime while maintaining the appearance of a somewhat normal family life. What's particularly ironic about Rick's arrangement with the Smith family is how it evolved over time. While his initial motivation was strategic, using Morty as camouflage and the family as bait for Rick Prime, the relationship gradually developed authentic elements. Rick's grudging affection for Morty grew beyond mere utility, and his relationship with Summer expanded despite her not being part of his original plan. Even his antagonistic dynamic with Jerry took on a life of its own beyond simple contempt. This calculated approach to family explains many of Rick's contradictory behaviors in the early seasons. He constantly belittles and endangers Morty while simultaneously protecting him fiercely from certain threats. He mocks family attachments while going to extreme lengths to rescue family members when they're in danger. These weren't inconsistencies in character, but rather the result of Rick's conflicted motivations, using the family as a means to an end while gradually forming genuine attachments to them. The Smith family garage becoming Rick's laboratory symbolizes this duality perfectly. It's both the heart of his scientific work and physically attached to the family home, separate but connected, just like Rick himself. His portal gun, the most significant of his inventions, allows him to escape the family at any moment while paradoxically making it possible for him to return to them consistently, unlike Rick Prime, who abandoned them. Season 6 provided the clearest confirmation of Rick's true motivations when he admitted to Morty that he chose their family specifically because it was Rick Prime's original family. This revelation recontextualized all of Rick's previous interactions with the Smiths. His frequent absences weren't just about adventures, but continuing his hunt for Rick Prime. His protective measures around the house weren't just paranoia, but practical safeguards against the return of his nemesis. Even his decision to take Morty on dangerous adventures served multiple purposes, training Morty as a potential ally against Rick Prime while also using him as bait and camouflage. When analyzing Rick's decision to move in with the Smiths, we have to consider how it compares to his previous attempt at settling down. During his wandering years, Rick had tried and failed to establish connections multiple times. The difference with the Smith family wasn't just that they were related to him, or at least to a version of him. It was that this arrangement served his revenge quest directly. Rick could allow himself to form attachments because they didn't distract from his primary goal, but actually facilitated it. The relationship between Rick and this particular Morty proved to be unique among all Rick-Morty pairs across the multiverse. Despite Rick's calculating reasons for choosing him, this Morty developed a resilience and understanding that most other Mortys never achieved. Their dynamic evolved from Rick's complete dominance to something more balanced, with Morty occasionally challenging Rick successfully. This wasn't part of Rick's original plan, but became one of its most significant unintended consequences. Morty's growing independence revealed a truth far more disturbing than his grandfather's manipulations. While their relationship evolved beyond Rick's cold calculations, something much bigger had been happening behind the scenes the entire time. The central finite curve stands as Rick's most ambitious creation, not a device or weapon, but a fundamental restructuring of the multiverse itself designed to ensure his intellectual supremacy would never be challenged. What makes the central finite curve so fascinating is that it wasn't solely Rick C-137's creation. The timing of its establishment suggests it came after the Citadel of Ricks was formed, pointing to a rare instance of collaboration between multiple Ricks across dimensions. This is particularly significant given how fiercely independent most Ricks are. They apparently found common ground in their shared desire to maintain intellectual dominance across reality. The Season 5 finale, Rick Mirai Jack, provided the most clarity about this cosmic manipulation. The curve functions as a massive wall, isolating all universes where Rick is the smartest being from the wider, truly infinite multiverse. This revelation adds a whole new layer to every adventure we've witnessed. When Rick casually dismisses the intelligence of beings across countless dimensions, it's not just his ego talking. He's literally traveling through universes that were specifically selected to ensure his intellectual dominance. This explains so much about Rick's consistent pattern of outwitting everyone he encounters. No matter how advanced a civilization or how powerful its technology, Rick always finds a way to overcome it. This isn't just plot armor or convenient writing. It's the direct result of the curve's existence. Rick and his fellow variants engineered their reality to ensure they would always be the smartest beings in any universe they visited. The implications of this are profound. It suggests that despite his seemingly boundless confidence, Rick harbors deep-seated fears about what might exist beyond the curve. What kinds of beings or intelligences might populate those universes where Rick isn't the smartest entity? The very creation of the curve points to an existential insecurity at Rick's core, a fear that somewhere out there might be minds that could challenge or exceed his own. Even more fascinating is considering what motivated other Ricks to participate in creating this cosmic partition. While Rick C-137 is driven by trauma and revenge, most other Ricks simply abandoned their families to explore the multiverse. Yet they all agreed to this massive undertaking, suggesting a shared vulnerability among all Rick variants. They all need to be the smartest person in the room, no matter which dimension that room exists in. The construction of the curve itself must have been an engineering feat of unimaginable proportions. To identify, categorize, and isolate specific universes based on the relative intelligence of beings within them would require technology and understanding far beyond anything we've seen Rick use in his day-to-day adventures. It speaks to capabilities that make his portal gun look like a children's toy by comparison. This revelation also recontextualizes Rick's relationship with the Citadel. While he vocally despises the bureaucracy and conformity it represents, he participated in its most significant project. Did he see the curve as a necessary evil? Was he manipulated into contributing? Or did he recognize that even he, the Rickest Rick, benefited from ensuring his intellectual dominance across the multiverse? When Rick first appeared at Beth's doorstep, he didn't just bring his baggage of trauma and alcoholism. He brought this fundamentally altered version of reality with him. Every adventure Morty has been on has taken place within this carefully constructed cage. The Smith family has never experienced the true, unlimited multiverse, only the section Rick helped cordon off to protect his ego. Season 6 expanded this concept even further by showing the consequences of evil Morty's escape from the curve. By breaking through this barrier, evil Morty didn't just escape Rick's influence, he damaged the integrity of the entire system. This forces Rick to potentially confront what lies beyond his carefully constructed reality. What beings might now find their way into the curve? What might Rick discover if he ventures beyond it? The philosophical implications are just as significant as the scientific ones. In a truly infinite multiverse, there would necessarily be beings of every possible intelligence level. By isolating only those universes where he reigns supreme, Rick has effectively created a false reality, one that reinforces his own superiority. It's the ultimate expression of his God complex, rewriting the very rules of existence to ensure he remains on top. This also explains why Rick puts so little effort into maintaining relationships. In a multiverse specifically designed to never challenge his intelligence, other beings can only provide limited value. They can't teach him anything new or help him solve problems he couldn't solve himself. The curve creates a fundamental loneliness for Rick. He has ensured he'll never meet an equal or superior mind within it. The irony is palpable. Rick's search for freedom through multiverse travel led him to create the ultimate prison, not just for others, but for himself. He trapped himself in a reality where he'll never be truly challenged intellectually, where he'll never encounter a mind that could push him to grow beyond his current limitations. His fear of not being the smartest has prevented him from ever discovering what he might learn from those who are. We can also now understand why Rick consistently describes himself as the Rickest Rick within the confines of the central finite curve. That's literally true by design. He's ensured that every universe he can access contains a version of himself that is the apex intellect of that reality. Other Ricks might have different personalities or make different choices, but none can surpass him in raw intelligence because the curve wouldn't include universes where that was possible. Evil Morty's escape represents the first real threat to this carefully maintained status quo. By breaking through the barrier, he's potentially opened a door for beings from beyond the curve to enter Rick's domain. For the first time, Rick might face intelligences that he can't simply outsmart or outmaneuver, forces that operate on levels he can't comprehend. His ultimate power play may have finally created a situation he can't control. Beyond the cosmic engineering of the central finite curve lies a deeply personal question that Rick never prepared for. What remains of a man when his sole purpose is suddenly fulfilled? For all his intellect, Rick never calculated the true cost of revenge. That killing Rick Prime would force him to confront a void where his motivation once lived. Season 7's Unmore-Tricken finally delivered the confrontation fans had anticipated for years. After tracking interdimensional signatures and following breadcrumbs across the cosmos, Rick C-137 cornered his family's killer in what should have been his moment of triumph. But what makes this showdown fascinating isn't just the physical battle, it's the psychological revelation that unfolds. When Rick finally came face to face with Rick Prime, the encounter wasn't what he expected. For decades, Rick had built up his nemesis as this formidable shadow figure, the architect of his suffering and the ultimate evil to be vanquished. Yet when confronted, Rick Prime revealed himself to be something far more mundane, yet infuriating: a coward. Unlike C-137, who confronts challenges directly, Rick Prime preferred to attack from a distance, hiding behind proxies and technology rather than facing his problems head-on. This confrontation becomes even more complex with Evil Morty's involvement. In a brilliant strategic move, Evil Morty manipulates both Ricks, exploiting their mutual hatred to gain control of the Omega device, the same weapon that Rick Prime had once used against Diane. The fact that this confrontation happens through this particular manipulation adds a bitter irony to Rick's revenge. After dedicating his existence to this moment, he nearly loses his chance because of yet another individual who outmaneuvered him. The actual defeat of Rick Prime happens with surprising brutality. Rick doesn't just kill his nemesis, he brutalizes him, releasing decades of pent-up rage in a visceral display of violence. Yet when the dust settles and Rick stands over the body of the man who took everything from him, something unexpected happens. When asked how it felt to finally kill Rick Prime, Rick delivers perhaps the most devastating line of the series. It felt exactly the same as before. This confession cuts to the core of Rick's character. For decades, revenge was the narrative he told himself. That once he killed Rick Prime, some fundamental wound would heal. But the emptiness he experiences in that moment of supposed victory forces a terrible realization. Revenge doesn't heal trauma. The void left by Diane's death remains unfilled. And now, without his quest to distract him, Rick must directly confront that emptiness. What makes this moment so powerful is how it transforms our understanding of Rick's journey. For 6 seasons, viewers witnessed a man who appeared to have it all figured out, the smartest being in the multiverse, unfettered by conventional morality or limitations. Yet this confrontation reveals that Rick's nihilism and apparent freedom were actually a prison of his own making. By dedicating his life to revenge, he avoided having to rebuild a life without Diane. He substituted purpose for healing. In the aftermath of Rick Prime's death, we see Rick struggle with a fundamental existential crisis. Without the driving force that has defined him for so long, who is he supposed to be now? This question sends ripples through the following episodes, particularly in Fear No More, where Rick attempts to find new meaning. His behavior becomes erratic, alternating between increased detachment and desperate attempts at connection. This identity crisis manifests in subtle ways. Rick's drinking patterns change, not necessarily less drinking, but drinking with a different quality of despair. His inventions become more reckless, his adventures more aimless. He even attempts to form deeper bonds with his family members, though these efforts are hampered by decades of emotional walls he's built around himself. The emotional fallout extends to Rick's relationship with Morty as well. Throughout their adventures, Morty has served as both Rick's moral compass and his unwitting accomplice. Now, with Rick Prime defeated, the dynamic shifts. Rick must confront the uncomfortable truth that he chose this particular Morty, partly because of his connection to Rick Prime's original family. With that motivation gone, Rick struggles to define what Morty means to him beyond utility. What emerges from this crisis is the beginning of Rick's potential redemption arc. For the first time since losing Diane, Rick must consider a future not defined by the past. His tentative efforts to build genuine connections with the Smith family take on new significance. These aren't just convenient relationships anymore, they're his potential path forward. Of course, Rick being Rick, this journey isn't linear or simple. He backslides into old patterns, uses sarcasm to deflect vulnerability, and sometimes sabotages his own progress. But beneath these defense mechanisms, we see glimpses of a man trying to rediscover his capacity for human connection. When Rick admits that killing Rick Prime felt exactly the same, he's not just expressing disappointment. He's acknowledging that his healing must come from somewhere else. The defeat of Rick Prime also marks a narrative milestone for the series itself. Rick's origin story, which had been teased and gradually revealed over multiple seasons, reaches its conclusion. The mystery that drove much of the show's mythology is resolved, leaving both Rick and the series to explore new territory. Just as Rick must find purpose beyond revenge, the show must find narrative momentum beyond its central mystery. In many ways, Rick's confrontation with Rick Prime serves as a dark mirror to his character. Both are brilliant scientists who revolutionized interdimensional travel. Both abandoned their original families, though for vastly different reasons. But where Rick Prime represents callous abandonment, Rick C-137 represents tortured devotion. Rick Prime fled responsibility. Rick C-137 was consumed by it. Their final confrontation isn't just about revenge, it's about Rick rejecting the path that Rick Prime represents. The philosophical implications of this confrontation extend beyond Rick's personal journey. Throughout the series, Rick has espoused a nihilistic worldview, arguing that nothing matters in an infinite multiverse. Yet his decades-long quest for revenge contradicts this philosophy. If nothing truly mattered, Why dedicate his life to avenging Diane? Rick's actions reveal a truth he's reluctant to admit, that some things do matter to him deeply and painfully. While Rick's actions contradict his nihilistic claims, his body language tells an even more revealing story. What most fans dismiss as simple comedic quirks, the constant burping, the repetitive name-calling, even his absurd catchphrases, actually function as a sophisticated psychological defense system, each one encoding a specific trauma from his past that he can't bring himself to address directly. Rick's most noticeable physical mannerism, his constant burping, isn't just a random comedic device the show's creators inserted for laughs. This persistent habit directly connects to his alcoholism, which didn't just develop randomly, but emerged specifically as a coping mechanism after witnessing his family's murder. What began as occasional drinking to numb the pain transformed into a defining characteristic during his decades-long quest to hunt down Rick Prime. The physical manifestation of this addiction, the burping, serves as a constant reminder of his unresolved grief, quite literally interrupting his speech the way his trauma interrupts his ability to form healthy connections. Even more fascinating is how Rick's most recognizable catchphrase contains a hidden cry for help. Wooba looba dub dub sounds like meaningless, absurd gibberish to casual viewers and even to most characters within the show. However, as Bird Person revealed in Season 1's Ricksy Business, these seemingly nonsensical words actually translate to, "I am in great pain. Please help me," in Bird Person's language. This linguistic encryption showcases Rick's psychological complexity. He's simultaneously expressing his deepest suffering while disguising it as comedy, making light of his own pain to keep others at a distance. The timing of this catchphrase's origin provides additional psychological insight. It emerged during Rick's rebellion years fighting alongside Bird Person and Squanchy, suggesting that during this period Rick was actually more emotionally vulnerable with his closest allies. By later adopting this phrase as an ironic catchphrase, Rick transformed a genuine expression of suffering into a joke, reflecting his evolution toward emotional detachment. This linguistic shift mirrors his psychological transformation, taking something sincere and weaponizing it with irony to prevent authentic connection. Rick's speech patterns reveal additional layers of his psychological state. His habit of repeatedly calling Morty's name, Morty, Morty, might seem like simple impatience or exasperation, but it potentially stems from a deeper psychological need. Having lost his original daughter Beth in his home dimension, Rick's repetitive calling of Morty's name could represent an unconscious determination never to lose another family member, a linguistic tether keeping Morty close when Rick's actual emotional capabilities fail him. The urgency in these repetitions betrays Rick's fear of disconnection, despite his claims of detachment. The staccato rhythm of Rick's speech, frequently punctuated by insults, burps, and sudden topic changes, creates a conversational defense mechanism. By controlling the pace and direction of conversation, Rick prevents others from steering discussions toward his vulnerabilities. This verbal agility serves as both shield and weapon, allowing him to maintain his carefully constructed facade of indifference while keeping emotional threats at a distance. Rick's frequent nihilistic pronouncements about how nothing matters aren't philosophical abstractions but direct responses to his personal experiences. Having witnessed infinite dimensions where every possibility exists, Rick uses nihilism as a psychological buffer against caring too deeply about any single reality, especially after losing his original family. When Rick dismisses morality or meaning, he's not merely being cynical, he's actively practicing emotional self-preservation. If nothing matters, then the pain of losing Diane doesn't have to matter either. Even Rick's laboratory practices reflect his psychological state. His habit of naming inventions after himself, Time Rickless, Rickdiculousness, represents more than simple narcissism. It's a form of existential grounding, stamping his identity across the multiverse as reassurance of his own significance in a reality where infinite versions of himself exist. Each named invention serves as a marker of uniqueness in a cosmos that constantly challenges the value of individuality. His relationship with technology itself forms another linguistic window into his psyche. Rick speaks to his inventions, curses them, and often anthropomorphizes them in ways that suggest he finds mechanical relationships more manageable than human ones. His battery-powered miniature universe in The Ricks Must Be Crazy demonstrates how Rick creates systems he can fully control, compensating for the cosmic chaos that took his family from him. Rick's improvisational genius, his ability to create complex technology from minimal resources, manifests in his speech as well. His tendency to craft neologisms and blend scientific terminology with casual profanity mirrors his approach to invention. Just as he cobbles together dimensional portals from junkyard scraps, he assembles language in unexpected ways, breaking conventional rules while still achieving his communicative goals. This linguistic flexibility reflects his adaptability in a multiverse that continually challenges his understanding. Perhaps most revealing is what Rick doesn't say. His strategic silences around his true history with Diane, his reluctance to directly address his feelings for his family, and his deflection of serious emotional conversations all point to profound avoidance. These conversational gaps serve as emotional black holes, areas so dense with pain that not even words can escape their gravity. When pressed about his feelings, Rick typically responds with deflection, alcohol, or portal gun escape, verbal and physical evasions that preserve his emotional armor. What makes Rick's mannerisms particularly poignant is how they form a coherent psychological profile when viewed together. His burping, catchphrases, name repetitions, and nihilistic statements aren't random character traits but interconnected responses to specific traumas, linguistic and physical manifestations of grief, guilt, and isolation. These quirks collectively create a defensive perimeter around his vulnerability, using humor, intellect, and substance abuse to mask a profound emotional wound that never healed. What if I told you that Rick Sanchez wasn't always the complex character we know today? When Rick first bursts into the Smith family home in the pilot episode, he appears to be little more than a cartoonish mad scientist archetype, complete with wild hair, a lab coat, and a flask permanently attached to his hand. This initial introduction seems straightforward. He's eccentric, he's brilliant, and he's constantly drinking. But even in these earliest moments, the writers were carefully planting the seeds for one of animation's most layered characters. Rick's arrival at the Smith household isn't just a plot device, it's actually our first glimpse into the profound disconnect between his scientific abilities and his human relationships. He shows up unannounced after a 20-year absence from his daughter's life, immediately disrupting the family dynamic without explanation or apology. This unexplained gap isn't just a throwaway detail. It's our first clue that something significant happened in Rick's past, something that would eventually form the cornerstone of his character development throughout the series. What makes Rick's early characterization so fascinating is how the writers balanced his undeniable genius with his complete disregard for social norms. He can create interdimensional portal technology that defies the laws of physics, yet he can't, or won't, engage in basic family interactions without deflection or sarcasm. This juxtaposition isn't accidental. It's a deliberate character choice that hints at deeper psychological wounds. When we watch Rick in these early episodes, we're seeing someone who has intentionally walled himself off from emotional connections. The pilot episode's portrayal of Rick as erratic and boundary-crossing seems initially played for laughs, but it actually establishes important patterns that will be explored throughout the series. His alcoholism isn't just a quirky character trait, it's a coping mechanism. His disregard for Jerry isn't simple antagonism. It's a rejection of everything conventional and ordinary. These early episodes don't explain these behaviors, but they consistently show them, training viewers to notice Rick's patterns long before we understand their origins. Rick's catchphrases and verbal tics initially seem like simple comedy devices. His burps mid-sentence, his peculiar way of addressing Morty, and eventually his wubba-lubba-dub-dub all appear to be random quirks designed for humor. What's remarkable about the show's construction is how these seemingly superficial traits are later revealed to have deeper significance. They aren't just comedic flourishes, they're defense mechanisms, ways for Rick to maintain his carefully constructed persona and avoid genuine vulnerability. The relationship between Rick and Morty in these early episodes is particularly revealing. On the surface, Rick seems to view Morty as little more than a convenient sidekick and human shield. He drags Morty into dangerous situations, dismisses his concerns, and generally treats him as disposable. But even in these early adventures, there are subtle moments that hint at something more complex beneath the surface. There are flashes where Rick shows genuine concern for Morty's well-being, moments where his callous facade briefly slips to reveal something more complicated. What's particularly interesting about these early episodes is how deliberately they avoid explaining Rick's background. The writers make a conscious choice to present Rick as a complete mystery. We don't know where he's been for 20 years. We don't know what happened to Morty's grandmother. We don't know why Rick suddenly decided to return to his daughter's life. This narrative vacuum creates enormous space for viewers to speculate, while also setting up the gradual revelations that would come in later seasons. Looking at creator commentary from the early production of the show, we can see that Rick's character evolved significantly from initial concept to final execution. He was first conceived as a much more one-dimensional figure, but the writers quickly recognized the potential to build something more complex. The mad scientist archetype became a starting point rather than the entire character, allowing Rick to grow into someone far more nuanced than his initial appearance suggested. Beth's relationship with Rick in these early episodes provides another layer to his characterization. Her desperate need for her father's approval, even after a 20-year absence, suggests a complicated family history that we're only seeing fragments of. Beth's willingness to overlook Rick's disruptive behavior and defend him against Jerry's complaints tells us volumes about their past relationship and the emotional void his absence created. Without explicitly stating anything about Rick's history as a father, these interactions paint a clear picture of someone who left significant emotional damage in his wake. What makes Rick's early characterization so effective is how it establishes him as someone who can build anything except meaningful connections. His portal gun can access infinite realities, but he can't bridge the emotional distance between himself and his family. This fundamental contradiction becomes the engine for much of Rick's character development throughout the series, as his scientific abilities repeatedly come into conflict with his emotional limitations. The seemingly exploitative relationship between Rick and Morty in these early episodes contains subtle contradictions that hint at Rick's true complexity. While he puts Morty in danger and dismisses his concerns, he also occasionally shows glimpses of genuine protection and even affection. These moments are brief and often immediately undermined by Rick himself, but they plant the first seeds of what will become one of animation's most interesting partnerships. What's particularly masterful about Rick's early characterization is how much is implied rather than stated. The show trusts viewers to notice patterns and inconsistencies, to question why someone so brilliant would also be so self-destructive, to wonder what could have happened to make Rick so resistant to emotional connections. This restraint in the writing creates space for the gradual revelations that would come later, allowing Rick's character to unfold organically rather than through exposition. Behind every brilliant invention and interdimensional adventure lies a man so burdened by his own mind that he literally created a catchphrase encoding a cry for help. Rick's intelligence isn't the gift everyone assumes it to be. It's the source of his deepest suffering. Throughout the series, we witness a man who can bend reality to his will, yet remains trapped in an isolated existence where no one, not even other versions of himself, can truly understand what it means to see reality as he does. Consider the episode Rick Potion number 9, where Rick's scientific abilities are on full display. He effortlessly creates a potion that's supposed to make Morty attractive to his crush, but when things spiral out of control, the situation transforms into something far more chaotic. People start turning into what Rick calls Cronenbergs, horrific mutated monsters that overrun the entire planet. What's particularly telling isn't just that Rick makes a mistake, but how he responds to it. Despite his unparalleled intelligence, Rick can't fix what he's broken. Instead, he resorts to abandoning that reality entirely, finding a dimension where alternate versions of themselves conveniently died, allowing Rick and Morty to replace them. This pattern appears repeatedly throughout the series. Rick can solve almost any scientific problem but consistently fails when it comes to emotional intelligence or maintaining relationships. His genius creates solutions that often lead to even bigger problems, forcing him into an endless cycle of scientific problem-solving that never addresses his underlying emotional issues. Perhaps the most direct acknowledgement of Rick's suffering comes through his seemingly nonsensical catchphrase, "Wubba lubba dub dub." While initially presented as meaningless gibberish, we later learn it translates to, "I am in great pain, please help me," in the language of bird person's culture. This revelation transforms what seemed like an eccentric verbal tick into a coded distress signal that Rick has been broadcasting all along. His intelligence has made him so isolated that he can only express his pain through a foreign language that almost no one around him understands. Rick's creations often function as physical manifestations of his psychological state. The Meeseeks box exemplifies his desire to offload responsibility, creating beings whose sole purpose is to complete a single task before ceasing to exist. Similarly, his memory eraser represents his desperate wish to escape painful emotions rather than process them. Each invention reveals something profound about Rick's internal struggles, particularly how his intelligence leads him to externalize emotional problems as technical challenges to be solved. The Council of Ricks presents one of the show's most fascinating explorations of Rick's isolation. You might expect that an organization comprising infinite versions of himself would provide Rick with true peers who understand him, yet even among other Ricks, he remains an outsider. The Council represents a bureaucratic, conformist approach to being Rick that our Rick fiercely rejects. This rejection illustrates a profound truth. Even when surrounded by versions of himself who share his intelligence, Rick remains fundamentally alone. No one, not even himself, can truly understand his specific experience. Rick's intelligence allows him to perceive the meaninglessness of existence in a multiverse where infinite possibilities exist simultaneously. While this awareness grants him tremendous freedom from conventional morality and consequences, it also burdens him with an existential perspective that others can't comprehend. His nihilistic philosophy stems directly from his intelligence. When you're smart enough to see that nothing inherently matters in an infinite multiverse, finding personal meaning becomes extraordinarily difficult. Rick's relationship with Unity, a hive mind being capable of controlling entire civilizations, provides a rare glimpse into his need for connection with an entity that can match his intellect. For a brief moment, we see Rick genuinely happy in a relationship with someone who can process information at his level. Their connection is built on a shared intellectual experience that Rick can't have with ordinary individuals. Yet even this relationship ultimately fails, as Unity recognizes that Rick's self-destructive tendencies would eventually corrupt her as well. The episode ends with one of the show's darkest moments, as Rick, devastated by this rejection, nearly attempts suicide after Unity abandons him. This pattern extends to Rick's interactions with other intelligent beings throughout the series. He tends to view them either as potential romantic partners, as with Unity, or as rivals to be dominated, as with Zeep Zonflorp in the Microverse Battery episode. Rick struggles to form balanced relationships with intellectual peers, reflecting how his intelligence has warped his ability to connect with others on equal terms. The cruel paradox of Rick's existence is that his greatest strength is simultaneously the source of his deepest suffering. His intelligence grants him godlike powers within the multiverse, but isolates him from meaningful connections. He can create life, cure death, and bend reality itself, yet he still needs that flask permanently attached to his hand, a constant reminder that all his genius can't solve his emotional pain. Substances become his primary method of numbing his awareness, of temporarily quieting the relentless activity of his mind. When Rick creates the Cronenbergs in Rick Potion number 9, he demonstrates not just his scientific prowess, but the limitations of his genius. Despite having the knowledge to transform an entire planet's population, he lacks the foresight or emotional intelligence to anticipate the consequences of his actions. More tellingly, when faced with a problem he can't solve, he doesn't persevere or take responsibility. He simply finds a new reality where he hasn't yet destroyed everything. His genius becomes a crutch that allows him to avoid the emotional growth that might actually address his unhappiness. The true burden of Rick's intelligence isn't just knowing more than everyone else, it's being unable to unknow what he knows. He can't pretend that actions have fixed consequences in a multiverse of infinite possibilities. He can't pretend that personal connections have ultimate meaning when everyone exists in infinite variations across countless dimensions. His intelligence prevents him from embracing the comforting illusions that allow others to find contentment in their limited perspectives. For all his interdimensional travel capabilities and scientific breakthroughs, there's one relationship that cuts through Rick's nihilistic armor: the complicated bond with his daughter. What happens when the smartest man in the universe can't solve the most basic problem of all? How to be a father. The relationship between Rick and Beth represents one of the most fascinating paradoxes in his character. Here's a man who can create life from nothing, bend reality to his will, and access infinite timelines. Yet he struggles with the simple act of showing affection to his only daughter. Their dynamic isn't just emotionally complex. It's a mirror that reflects Rick's deepest fears about himself. In The ABCs of Beth, we get our most revealing glimpse into this father-daughter relationship. The episode presents us with a stunning revelation. Beth inherited not just Rick's intelligence, but also his capacity for violence and creative destruction. As a child, she was so dangerous that Rick created an entire fantasy dimension called Fruppyland, where she could play without harming real children. This wasn't just a father creating a playground. It was containment for a daughter he feared might follow his destructive path. What's particularly telling is Rick's solution when adult Beth finally confronts the limitations of her life. Rather than offering emotional support or guidance, he presents a scientific solution, creating a perfect clone of Beth that could stay with the family while the real Beth explores the universe. This decision reveals Rick's contradictory desires. He wants to give Beth the freedom he values above all else, but he also can't bear to completely sever their connection. It's a technological band-aid on an emotional wound. The clone solution also reveals something profound about Rick's approach to fatherhood. He offers Beth two paths: stay in a life she finds constraining or leave to explore the cosmos. But he refuses to take responsibility for guiding her choice. "I'm not going to take a stand and make your life easy," he tells her. This refusal to take a paternal stand isn't just indifference. It's fear disguised as respect for autonomy. Beth's marriage to Jerry represents everything Rick actively rejects: stability, emotional vulnerability, and contentment with mediocrity. When Rick moved in with the Smith family, his disdain for Jerry wasn't just about Jerry's intellectual limitations. It was about what Jerry represented: the stable family life Rick abandoned and continues to undermine. Jerry is a constant reminder of Beth's choice to create exactly the kind of conventional life Rick fled from, making their dynamic not just about a father-in-law, son-in-law conflict, but about competing visions of what Beth's life should be. What makes this relationship even more complex is that Rick's inability to express genuine affection doesn't mean he doesn't care. His actions frequently betray deeper feelings than his words admit. When Beth's safety is threatened, we see cracks in Rick's cynical armor, moments of genuine concern that he quickly covers with sarcasm or scientific detachment. It's in these unguarded moments that we glimpse the father beneath the scientist, someone who does care but lacks the emotional vocabulary to express it directly. The most poignant aspect of their relationship is that Beth continues to seek Rick's approval despite decades of abandonment. Her desperate need for validation from the father who left her mirrors Rick's own unresolved issues. In many ways, Beth represents Rick's greatest failure. Not a scientific experiment gone wrong, but a human connection he couldn't maintain. His 20-year absence from her life wasn't just neglect. It shaped her entire identity around his missing presence. This abandonment forms the core of Beth's character. She became a horse surgeon rather than a human doctor, close to her dream but not quite achieving it. Much like her relationship with Rick hovers near connection without fully achieving it. When Rick returned to her life, Beth immediately welcomed him, demonstrating how desperately she needed his validation, even after years of absence. Rick's guilt over abandoning Beth manifests in his conflicted behavior toward her. He can't bring himself to fully embrace the role of father, yet he can't completely detach either. His solution, remaining physically present while emotionally distant, creates a painful dynamic where Beth constantly seeks approval he's structurally incapable of providing. Their relationship takes on additional complexity when we consider Rick's fear that Beth might inherit his worst traits. His concern isn't just that she's smart and potentially violent. It's that she might follow his pattern of destroying relationships and finding herself ultimately alone. When Rick sees Beth's intelligence and capacity for violence, he's not just seeing his daughter, he's seeing a version of himself, and it terrifies him. Beth's marriage to Jerry symbolizes everything Rick rejects about conventional life, yet it also represents what he couldn't provide: stability and commitment. Rick's rejection of Jerry isn't just about Jerry's intellectual limitations. It's about Rick's inability to accept the choices Beth has made to create a life different from his own. Jerry is a living reminder of the conventional family life Rick abandoned and continues to undermine. Perhaps the most telling aspect of Rick's relationship with Beth comes in those rare moments when his defenses drop. When Beth's safety is threatened, Rick's actions reveal the depth of his care, even as his words continue to maintain emotional distance. These glimpses of vulnerability suggest that beneath Rick's callous exterior lies a father who does care deeply, but has built such elaborate defenses that he can barely access those feelings himself. The tragedy of Rick and Beth's relationship is that it's built on a foundation of absence. Beth's entire identity formed around the missing presence of her father, while Rick's identity as a father was shaped by his decision to leave. Their reunion doesn't heal this wound. It merely brings it into sharper focus. Beth continues to seek the approval of a man constitutionally incapable of providing it, while Rick remains trapped between wanting connection and fearing its consequences. While Beth grew up haunted by her father's absence, Rick himself was running from a ghost of his own. Behind all the portal-hopping and universe-jumping stands a simple, devastating fact that the show kept hidden for years. Rick isn't just a man who abandoned his family. He's a man whose family was taken from him in the most violent way possible. For 3 seasons, viewers caught only fleeting references to Rick's wife, Diane. These brief mentions were like puzzle pieces scattered throughout episodes, intentionally withholding the complete picture of who she was and what happened to her. This narrative gap created one of the show's most compelling mysteries. What could possibly have happened to transform a man into the nihilistic, self-destructive genius we know? The answer began to take shape in the Season 3 premiere, The Rick Shank Redemption. In what initially appeared to be a fabricated memory designed to trick his captors, Rick showed us a scene of a different Rick entering his garage, killing his wife Diane and daughter Beth with a bomb. At the time, the show framed this as a clever lie, Rick's way of escaping imprisonment by feeding false information to his enemies. The scene was disturbing but dismissed as merely another example of Rick's manipulative genius. But as the series progressed, the truth gradually emerged. This supposedly fake memory contained far more reality than fiction. Later episodes confirmed that Rick Prime, the Rick from Morty's original dimension, actually did murder Diane and Beth in our Rick's original reality. This wasn't just another adventure gone wrong or a scientific experiment with unintended consequences. This was a deliberate act of violence that shattered Rick's entire existence. This singular event explains almost everything about the Rick we've come to know. His inability to form meaningful attachments isn't just misanthropy, it's a defensive mechanism born from experiencing a loss so profound that he can never fully recover from it. Once you've watched your family murdered before your eyes, the idea of building new connections becomes terrifying. Every potential bond represents another vulnerability, another person who could be taken away. The revelation about Rick Prime using the Omega device adds another layer of tragedy to Rick's story. This device didn't just kill Diane in one universe, it effectively erased her from every universe. This explains the conspicuous absence of any alternate versions of Diane throughout the show's multiverse-spanning adventures. Unlike Beth, Jerry, Summer, and Morty, who exist in countless variations across infinite realities, Diane remains a ghost, someone Rick can never find again, no matter how many dimensions he visits. In the absence of his family, Rick found a new purpose: revenge. His decades-long hunt for Rick Prime became the organizing principle of his existence, the thread connecting all his seemingly random adventures. Every technological advancement, every new invention, every journey to a strange dimension, all of it served his ultimate goal of finding and killing the Rick who destroyed his life. This quest for vengeance gives us a new perspective on Rick's character. His cynicism and emotional detachment aren't his natural state. Their adaptations developed in response to trauma and sustained by his single-minded pursuit of revenge. The scope of Rick's revenge mission changed the very fabric of the multiverse. His search for Rick Prime led him to encounter countless other versions of himself, eventually resulting in the creation of the Citadel of Ricks, a massive interdimensional organization that fundamentally altered how Ricks across the multiverse interact with each other. What began as one man's personal vendetta evolved into a force that reshaped reality itself. Understanding Rick's origin story transforms how we view his relationship with alcohol. His drinking isn't just a personality quirk or a comedic device. It's a coping mechanism for dealing with grief and trauma that spans decades. The bottle becomes his constant companion, something he can rely on when the weight of his memories becomes too much to bear. When Rick drinks himself into oblivion, he's not just being irresponsible. He's trying to temporarily escape the pain that drives him. Similarly, Rick's nihilistic philosophy takes on new meaning in light of his past. His insistence that nothing matters in an infinite multiverse isn't just an intellectual position. It's a psychological defense. If nothing matters, then the loss of Diane and Beth doesn't matter. If nothing matters, then his failure to protect them doesn't matter. If nothing matters, then the years he's spent consumed by revenge don't matter. His nihilism is an attempt to rationalize a pain that would otherwise be unbearable. This origin story also helps explain Rick's complicated relationship with the Beth we know. Having lost his original daughter, his interactions with alternate versions of Beth are inevitably colored by his trauma. He simultaneously wants to connect with her as a replacement for the daughter he lost and keeps his distance to protect himself from experiencing that same loss again. Every moment of tenderness between them is shadowed by the knowledge that she isn't really his Beth, and his original Beth is gone forever. The hunt for Rick Prime gave Rick purpose, but it also trapped him. As long as his life was defined by revenge, he could never truly move forward. His emotional development remained frozen at the moment of his family's death, preventing him from building new, healthy relationships. The tragedy of Rick becomes even more profound when we realize that his greatest scientific achievements, dimensional travel, the ability to transfer consciousness between bodies, the power to create and destroy worlds, all stem from his inability to process grief in a healthy way. By Season 7, when Rick finally confronts and kills Rick Prime, we see the full circle of his character journey. The revenge that sustained him for so long leaves him hollow once accomplished. Without this driving purpose, Rick is forced to confront the emptiness of his existence and the possibility that he might need to find a new way to live, one not defined by trauma and vengeance. After accomplishing his lifelong quest for revenge, Rick faces an existential vacuum where his driving purpose once lived. Yet all along, another relationship had been quietly transforming the universe's most isolated genius: his partnership with Morty. What began as exploitation gradually evolved into something neither of them could have predicted. Rick's initial reasons for keeping Morty around were purely practical. Morty's brainwaves function as a natural camouflage that masks Rick's genius-level brain activity from his enemies. This arrangement initially positioned Morty as nothing more than a useful tool, human cloaking technology with legs. Rick viewed his grandson as expendable, just another resource to exploit in his interdimensional adventures. But something unexpected happened as they traversed the cosmos together. Despite his determined efforts to maintain emotional distance, Rick began developing genuine care for Morty. This emotional evolution wasn't linear or straightforward. Rick constantly fights against acknowledging these feelings, burying them beneath layers of sarcasm, belittlement, and calculated indifference. His vulnerability emerges in brief, unguarded moments that he quickly covers with his typical cynicism. We see this complex dynamic play out in episodes like the Vat of Acid episode, where Rick's pettiness reaches spectacular heights. When Morty criticizes one of Rick's inventions, Rick constructs an elaborate scheme involving a fake acid vat and a save point device that ruins Morty's life and relationship, all to teach him not to question Rick's genius. On the surface, this appears to be Rick at his most vindictive, but it also reveals something deeper: Rick's profound insecurity about being challenged by Morty. The episode exposes how threatened Rick feels when Morty grows more confident and assertive, suggesting that Rick fears losing his position of unquestioned authority. While toxic relationships between Ricks and Mortys are the norm across the multiverse, the Ricklantis Mix-Up episode reveals that our Rick and Morty share something genuinely unique. This episode takes viewers to the Citadel, showing countless other Rick-Morty pairs with far more dysfunctional dynamics. Our Rick and Morty, despite their problems, demonstrate a growing mutual respect that sets them apart from their multiversal counterparts. Their connection, while still deeply flawed, contains something genuine that other pairs lack. This authentic bond becomes apparent in episodes like A Wrinkle in Time, where Rick makes a decision that fundamentally contradicts his stated nihilistic philosophy. When faced with certain death, Rick willingly sacrifices himself to save Morty. For someone who repeatedly insists that nothing matters in an infinite multiverse, this action reveals that Morty matters to Rick in ways he cannot verbally acknowledge. These moments of self-sacrifice directly challenge Rick's carefully constructed persona as someone incapable of genuine attachment. As their adventures continue, we witness Morty's remarkable growth. He gradually absorbs Rick's scientific knowledge, develops his own problem-solving skills, and becomes increasingly assertive in their partnership. This evolution fundamentally changes their dynamic, from pure exploitation to something closer to an actual partnership. While Rick continues to have the upper hand in their relationship, Morty's growing competence forces Rick to adapt and, on occasion, even acknowledge Morty's contributions. The transformation in their relationship reaches a revealing moment in Fear No More, where Rick's greatest fear is exposed. Not death, not failure, but abandonment by Morty. This episode strips away Rick's carefully maintained facade, revealing that beneath his callous exterior lies a deep attachment that terrifies him. Rick, who can replace anything in the multiverse with identical versions from other dimensions, has developed a connection to this specific Morty that cannot be substituted. This vulnerability in Rick's emotional armor creates cracks through which genuine growth becomes possible. What makes this evolution so significant is that it occurs despite Rick's concerted efforts to prevent it. Rick doesn't want to care about Morty. Caring creates vulnerability, and vulnerability leads to pain. Yet the more he resists this connection, the stronger it seems to grow. Their shared experiences, dangers, and rare moments of genuine communication gradually forge a bond that neither of them anticipated or initially wanted. The evidence of Rick's attachment appears in subtle ways throughout the series. He could easily find another Morty with identical brainwaves if that were all he needed. Yet he goes to extraordinary lengths to keep this particular Morty in his life. When Morty is in danger, Rick's usual calculated demeanor often gives way to panicked efforts to save him. These moments reveal that Rick's connection to Morty has transcended mere utility and entered the dangerous territory of emotional investment. For Morty, this relationship initially seems overwhelmingly negative, being dragged across dimensions, placed in mortal danger, and constantly belittled. Yet Morty also gains something unique from Rick: a window into the infinite possibilities of existence, scientific knowledge beyond what any normal teenager could access, and gradually, a relationship with the universe's most isolated genius that no one else has managed to achieve. The evolution of their partnership also demonstrates Rick's capacity for growth, something that would seem impossible given his centuries of hardened cynicism. Rick begins to show signs of emotional development, moments of vulnerability, and occasional willingness to compromise. Small changes that represent seismic shifts for someone as rigid as Rick. These changes don't transform him into a warm, emotionally available grandfather, but they do reveal cracks in his nihilistic armor. Morty becomes the one person Rick cannot replace, creating a vulnerability that forces him to confront aspects of himself he's spent decades avoiding. In a universe where Rick can literally replace any person, object, or memory with alternatives from infinite dimensions, his growing attachment to this specific Morty challenges the very foundation of his philosophy. If nothing matters because everything is infinitely replaceable, what does it mean when Rick discovers something irreplaceable? The green portal that defines Rick Sanchez represents far more than just a convenient plot device for adventure. When Rick opens that swirling gateway, he's not just traveling across dimensions, he's escaping the fundamental human condition of consequences. That ability to simply walk away from any situation warps his entire relationship with existence. The profound psychological impact of having an infinite escape hatch has twisted Rick's perception of reality in ways that explain his deepest character traits. That irreplaceable connection to Morty challenges Rick's entire worldview, but it's his green portal technology that created his existential crisis in the first place. The same device that grants Rick godlike powers to escape any situation also traps him in perhaps the universe's cruelest paradox. When everything is possible, nothing can truly matter. The portal gun doesn't just transport Rick across dimensions, it transforms him into a being who exists outside the normal boundaries of consequence. Think about it. For normal people, actions have weight because they're permanent. Break something, it stays broken. Hurt someone, they remain hurt. But for Rick, any mistake can be erased simply by stepping through a portal. When his experiments go catastrophically wrong, he doesn't have to live with the fallout. This escape mechanism fundamentally alters how Rick processes reality. When he creates an apocalyptic scenario in Rick Potion number 9, his solution isn't to fix the problem. It's to find a dimension where the problem solved itself, but where that dimension's Rick and Morty conveniently died. He and Morty simply step into their counterparts' lives, leaving their ruined dimension behind. This approach to problems reveals something deeply disturbing about Rick's relationship with consequence. He treats entire universes as disposable when they become inconvenient. The central finite curve represents Rick's most substantial manipulation of the multiverse itself. By deliberately creating a wall between universes where he's the smartest being and those where he isn't, Rick reveals a profound insecurity beneath his confident exterior. In essence, Rick rigged the cosmic game in his favor. He couldn't bear the existence of beings smarter than himself, so he literally restructured reality to ensure his supremacy remained unchallenged. This desperate need for control exposes the fear driving much of Rick's behavior, the fear of meeting something he can't outsmart or overcome. Rick's portal technology serves as more than just transportation. It's his ultimate emotional defense mechanism. Whenever conversations become too personal or emotions threaten to overwhelm him, Rick can simply create a portal and leave. We see this pattern repeatedly throughout the series, where Rick escapes not just physical threats but emotional vulnerabilities. This technological solution to emotional problems perfectly encapsulates Rick's approach to life. Why process difficult feelings when you can simply escape them? Season 6 presents a fascinating exploration of Rick's dependency on his portal technology when it breaks down. Without his usual escape routes, Rick is forced to confront his emotions and relationships directly. This breakdown of his primary defense mechanism creates a rare window of vulnerability, forcing Rick to develop coping mechanisms that don't involve simply abandoning difficult situations. In these moments, we see glimpses of a Rick who might actually grow as a person when his technological crutch is removed. The psychological burden of knowing infinite realities exist cannot be overstated. For Rick, the awareness that nothing matters in a truly infinite multiverse contributes significantly to his alcoholism and nihilistic outlook. When every possible outcome is happening simultaneously across infinite dimensions, the weight of any single choice diminishes to practically nothing. This awareness becomes an existential trap. If nothing matters because everything is happening somewhere, why care about anything at all? His drinking doesn't just help numb the pain of trauma, it helps blur the edges of an existence too vast and meaningless for a single consciousness to process healthily. Perhaps nothing illustrates Rick's complicated relationship with the multiverse better than the Citadel of Ricks. This organization represents the ultimate contradiction in Rick's character. He despises other versions of himself, yet feels compelled to organize with them. The Citadel embodies Rick's internal conflict, showing how he simultaneously rejects and embraces his own identity across dimensions. His hatred for other Ricks stems from seeing his own worst traits reflected back at him, while his participation in the Citadel reveals his inability to truly escape himself, no matter how many dimensions he traverses. This multiverse travel creates a profound philosophical paradox for Rick. While it grants him godlike power to shape reality according to his whims, it simultaneously strips away his ability to find genuine meaning in his existence. The more power Rick gains over reality through his portal gun, the less real anything feels to him. This creates the central conflict of his character, a man with the power to do almost anything, who struggles to find anything worth doing. His nihilism isn't just a personality trait, it's the inevitable psychological effect of a man who can literally abandon any reality that becomes too painful or inconvenient. The most haunting aspect of Rick's relationship with the multiverse is how it transforms his perception of people. In a world of infinite Beths, Jerrys, and Summers, what makes any particular version special? This question haunts Rick's ability to form genuine connections. If family members are essentially interchangeable across dimensions, why invest emotionally in any specific version? We see this thought process at work when Rick casually suggests replacing dead family members with alternates from other dimensions. For Rick, people become almost like products that can be swapped out when damaged, a horrifying perspective that explains his difficulty with genuine attachment. If Rick views people as replaceable across dimensions, then why does the series repeatedly show him risking everything for this specific version of his family? The contradiction between Rick's stated philosophy and his actual behavior reveals the most fascinating aspect of his character. He's built layers upon layers of emotional barricades to protect himself from further pain, all while his actions betray the fact that he still cares deeply. These defense mechanisms aren't just personality quirks, they're survival strategies for a man whose entire worldview shattered along with his original family. Looking closely at autoerotic assimilation, we witness a rare moment when Rick's emotional fortress completely collapses. After Unity, a hive-mind entity who could engage with Rick on his intellectual level while also providing the emotional connection he craves, breaks up with him, we see Rick return home in a deeply depressed state. The episode's closing sequence is devastating. Rick sets up a complex apparatus in his garage, unfreezes an alien creature, positions it beneath a death ray, and then slumps over his workbench in a defeated, intoxicated state. He ultimately passes out before completing what appears to be a suicide attempt. This singular moment completely shatters the facade Rick maintains throughout the series, offering viewers a glimpse of the profound pain he normally keeps hidden. Rick's intellect serves as perhaps his most effective shield against emotional vulnerability. Rather than processing grief, love, or loneliness as feelings to be experienced, he converts them into scientific problems with technical solutions. When faced with painful memories, he doesn't seek therapy. He invents a device to erase them. When confronted with complex family dynamics, he doesn't engage in difficult conversations. He creates scientific scenarios that allow him to maintain control. This intellectualization creates distance between Rick and his emotions, turning intensely personal experiences into abstract concepts he can analyze rather than feel. What makes Rick's character so compelling is that these defenses occasionally fail. His relationship with Bird Person represents one of the few authentic connections Rick allows himself to maintain. Unlike his family relationships, which are complicated by abandonment and guilt, Bird Person knows Rick from their revolutionary days, a time when Rick might have been more emotionally available. When Bird Person is killed, before being resurrected as Phoenix Person, Rick's genuine grief momentarily breaks through his cynical exterior. These brief moments of authentic emotion are powerful precisely because they're so rare in Rick's carefully constructed persona. Rick's workshop serves as a physical manifestation of his emotional barriers. It's a space where he maintains complete control, where family members must literally knock before entering, and where he can escape uncomfortable conversations by immersing himself in his projects. The garage isn't just where Rick builds his inventions, it's where he retreats when emotions threaten to overwhelm him. This physical space mirrors the mental compartmentalization Rick employs to keep his feelings safely contained and separate from his daily functioning. When Rick resorts to scientific solutions for emotional problems, he demonstrates one of his most consistent defense mechanisms. Throughout the series, we see him employing technology to avoid confronting his pain directly. Rather than working through his issues, Rick uses science as both escape and control mechanism. This tendency reveals his deeply ingrained pattern of using his greatest strength, his intellect, to shield himself from his greatest weakness, his emotions. The fortress Rick has built isn't just about keeping others out, it's about keeping his own emotions contained. His casual suggestion about replacing dead family members with alternates from other dimensions isn't merely callous. It's a desperate attempt to convince himself that relationships are disposable and therefore not worth the emotional investment. If he truly believed this, he wouldn't repeatedly risk everything to protect this particular version of his family. The contradiction lies at the heart of Rick's character. A man desperately trying to convince himself he doesn't care while his actions repeatedly prove otherwise. Episodes like The Wedding Squanchers provide rare glimpses of Rick without his defenses. When faced with the choice between abandoning his family or sacrificing his freedom to protect them, Rick surrenders himself to the Galactic Federation. This moment of apparent selflessness directly contradicts the nihilistic philosophy he espouses throughout the series. His emotional walls momentarily crumble, revealing a man capable of genuine care and sacrificial love, qualities Rick typically denies possessing. Rick's emotional architecture is also revealed through his drinking. While his alcoholism initially appears to be just an amusing character trait, it gradually becomes clear that it functions as self-medication. Alcohol helps numb the emotional pain that his other defense mechanisms can't fully contain. When Rick takes swigs from his flask during tense family moments, he's reinforcing his emotional barriers, blunting feelings that threaten to break through. His drinking isn't just about physical dependence, it's about maintaining the emotional distance he believes keeps him safe. The dance between vulnerability and isolation defines Rick's character arc throughout the series. While he constructs elaborate barriers to protect himself from emotional pain, these very barriers ensure he remains profoundly alone. By refusing to risk attachment, Rick guarantees he'll never heal from his original trauma. The moments when his defenses crack, revealing the wounded human beneath the cynical scientist, are among the most powerful in the series precisely because they're so rare and hard-won. What makes Rick's character truly groundbreaking is that, unlike most television characters who either remain static or experience clear growth, Rick exists in a constant state of tension between his defense mechanisms and his capacity for genuine connection. He simultaneously pushes people away and pulls them closer, rejects emotional attachment while forming meaningful bonds, and denies caring while repeatedly demonstrating that he does. This contradiction isn't a writing inconsistency, it's the essence of his character, a man fighting against his own capacity for love because he knows firsthand how devastating loss can be. Beyond Rick's elaborate emotional architecture lies a pattern so self-destructive it defies his reputation as the universe's smartest being. A man who can create life, bend reality, and traverse dimensions somehow can't stop himself from destroying every opportunity for genuine happiness that comes his way. This contradictory behavior reveals something profound about Rick's character. He doesn't believe he deserves peace or joy in his life. Rick's relationship with Unity provides perhaps the clearest example of this self-destructive tendency. When he finally connects with Unity, a hive mind being who understands him on an intellectual level, Rick finds himself in a rare moment of contentment. But rather than nurturing this relationship, he systematically sabotages it by pushing Unity away. There's something deeply revealing about this pattern. Whenever Rick approaches authentic happiness, he activates a series of behaviors guaranteed to destroy it. It's as if some part of him becomes uncomfortable with the possibility of healing and connection. This self-sabotage manifests spectacularly in Pickle Rick, where he transforms himself into a literal pickle to avoid attending family therapy. Think about the absurdity of this situation. Rick would rather turn himself into a vegetable and risk death than participate in an hour of emotional vulnerability with his family. When Dr. Wong later points out that Rick uses his intelligence to avoid confronting his personal issues, we see Rick's discomfort with this accurate assessment. He's created an elaborate system where any emotional growth can be circumvented through scientific means, allowing him to remain safely within his psychological fortress. Rick's intelligence serves as both his greatest asset and the primary tool of his self-destruction. His brilliant mind allows him to instantly analyze any relationship and identify potential problems, giving him seemingly rational reasons to disengage before true connection can form. When someone gets too close, Rick's mind provides him with perfectly logical excuses for why the relationship is doomed, sparing him the vulnerability of genuine intimacy. This pattern appears consistently throughout the series. Rick encounters someone who might understand him, briefly engages, then manufactures a scenario where the relationship must end. We see this self-defeating cycle play out in his interactions with Jerry as well. Rick constantly insults and alienates his son-in-law, creating an environment of perpetual conflict within the Smith household. While this behavior is often played for laughs, it serves a deeper psychological purpose. By maintaining this antagonistic relationship, Rick ensures a level of emotional distance from the entire family. Jerry represents stability, commitment, and emotional vulnerability, everything Rick fears and rejects. By keeping Jerry at arm's length through constant belittlement, Rick protects himself from the possibility of becoming truly integrated into the family unit. The most revealing aspect of Rick's self-sabotage emerges after he finally achieves his decades-long goal of killing Rick Prime in Season 7. After this momentous accomplishment, the very thing that has driven him across the multiverse, Rick immediately falls into an existential crisis. Rather than feeling closure or satisfaction, he experiences an emptiness that reveals how his quest for revenge functioned as a convenient distraction from his deeper psychological wounds. Without this motivation, Rick must confront the hollowness of his existence and the possibility that happiness might be attainable if he were willing to pursue it. Rick's alcoholism plays a crucial role in this self-destructive pattern, functioning as both symptom and cause of his behavior. His drinking allows him to maintain a convenient excuse for his actions. It's not Rick who pushes people away, it's the alcohol. This gives him plausible deniability for his most hurtful behaviors while providing a numbing effect that distances him from the emotional consequences of his choices. The flask becomes a physical manifestation of his unwillingness to experience life without a buffer, a portable defense mechanism he carries with him across dimensions. What makes Rick's self-sabotage particularly tragic is that unlike most people, he possesses the means to solve almost any external problem. He can build incredible technology, traverse dimensions, and even create new life forms. Yet he consistently fails at the one thing most humans struggle with, allowing himself to experience sustained happiness. This suggests his obstacles aren't external but internal. Rick is fighting against himself, and it's a battle he's programmed to lose. The pattern becomes even more apparent when we examine how Rick interacts with other characters who offer genuine connection. Bird Person represents one of Rick's oldest and most authentic friendships, yet Rick struggles to fully engage with this relationship. When Bird Person is killed and later resurrected as Phoenix Person, Rick's response reveals his complex relationship with attachment. He cares deeply, yet maintains emotional distance as a protective measure. This ambivalence characterizes all of Rick's meaningful relationships, creating a push-pull dynamic where he simultaneously seeks and rejects connection. Perhaps the most interesting aspect of Rick's self-sabotage is how it contradicts his stated philosophy of nihilism. If nothing truly matters in an infinite multiverse, then why does Rick so consistently ensure his own unhappiness? The answer seems to be that beneath his cynical exterior lies a moral framework where he believes he deserves punishment. His guilt over past actions, abandoning Beth, failing to protect Diane, the countless beings harmed during his adventures, manifests as a subconscious belief that he doesn't deserve peace. In this way, Rick's self-destructive behaviors aren't random, but serve a deeper psychological purpose. They're a form of self-punishment for a man who can't forgive himself. Rick's rationalization abilities allow him to maintain this pattern without confronting its true nature. When he sabotages relationships, he can always point to legitimate reasons why they wouldn't have worked, conveniently ignoring his role in manufacturing those circumstances. His genius becomes a shield against self-awareness, enabling him to continue the cycle of self-destruction while maintaining the illusion of control and choice. This is the tragic irony at the heart of Rick's character. The very intelligence that makes him exceptional also prevents him from achieving the emotional growth necessary for happiness. The same brilliant mind that Rick uses to justify his detachment contains a glaring contradiction that he never fully acknowledges. For someone who insists nothing matters in an infinite multiverse, why does Rick repeatedly put himself in mortal danger to protect the Smith family when he could simply abandon them for a new family in another reality? This contradiction is particularly evident in A Wrinkle in Time, where we witness something truly extraordinary. A moment where Rick is genuinely willing to die so Morty can live. When time splits into uncertain possibilities, Rick doesn't hesitate to sacrifice his own survival to ensure Morty's safety. This isn't the calculated move of someone who views his grandson as merely a brainwave shield or convenient sidekick. It's the instinctive response of someone who, despite his protest to the contrary, deeply cares. What makes these heroic moments so fascinating is how they directly contradict Rick's carefully constructed persona. He's built an entire philosophical framework around the idea that attachment is pointless in an infinite multiverse. Yet when faced with actual threats to his family, his actions tell a completely different story than his words. This isn't just inconsistency, it's a window into his true character beneath layers of cynical armor. The relationship between Rick and Bird Person offers another glimpse into this hidden moral code. Their history of fighting side by side against the Galactic Federation reveals that Rick hasn't always been the self-serving cynic he presents himself as. There was a time when he stood for something larger than himself, when he was willing to risk everything to fight against oppression. This suggests that beneath Rick's nihilistic exterior lies a man who once had strong idealistic motivations that occasionally still surface despite his best efforts to suppress them. We see this pattern continue in The Rick-Churian Morty Date, where Rick ultimately chooses to protect Morty during a conflict with the president. Rather than pursuing victory at all costs, Rick makes a choice that prioritizes Morty's well-being over his own ego. For someone who claims to care only about himself, this represents a significant moment of character growth, one that can't be easily explained away as self-interest. What's particularly telling about Rick's heroism is that it's often reluctant and unacknowledged. He'll go to extraordinary lengths to frame his selfless actions as somehow self-serving. After saving his family, he'll offer cynical justifications or make crude jokes to maintain his nihilistic persona. Yet the pattern remains consistent. When truly threatened, Rick consistently chooses to protect those he cares about, often at considerable personal risk. This reluctant heroism is most visible in how Rick approaches threats to the Smith family. Despite having access to infinite families across the multiverse, Rick repeatedly puts himself in danger to protect this specific family. He confronts aliens, government agencies, and interdimensional threats that he could easily avoid by simply stepping through a portal to another reality. The fact that he stays and fights reveals that, despite his claims to the contrary, this particular family matters to him in ways he refuses to openly acknowledge. Rick's protection of the Smith family goes beyond mere convenience or habit. In numerous episodes, we see him actively placing himself between his family and various dangers. He could easily abandon them to their fate. After all, in a multiverse with infinite possibilities, there are countless realities where they survive without his intervention. Yet time and again, Rick chooses to stay and fight, risking his own safety for people he claims not to care about. The contradiction between Rick's stated philosophy and his actions creates one of the most compelling aspects of his character. He maintains that nothing matters in an infinite multiverse where every possibility exists simultaneously. Yet his consistent willingness to fight for this specific family in this specific reality suggests that, on some level, he doesn't truly believe his own nihilistic rhetoric. His actions reveal that beneath his cynical exterior lies a man with genuine moral principles. Principles that occasionally override his self-interest despite his best efforts to deny them. This moral code is never explicitly stated or acknowledged by Rick himself. Instead, it emerges through his pattern of behavior across multiple episodes and seasons. Despite his claims of amorality, Rick demonstrates consistent ethical boundaries. He may be willing to exploit, manipulate, and deceive, but when faced with genuine threats to those he cares about, a different Rick emerges, one who is willing to sacrifice himself for others. What makes these moments of heroism particularly powerful is that they're never portrayed as easy or natural for Rick. Each selfless act appears to cause him genuine psychological discomfort, as if he's fighting against his own nature. Yet he makes these choices anyway, revealing a deeply buried capacity for connection and care that he works tirelessly to deny. In many ways, Rick's reluctant heroism represents his internal struggle between cynicism and hope. His intellect and experiences have shown him the meaninglessness of existence in an infinite multiverse, yet some part of him continues to act as if individual lives and relationships matter. This contradiction isn't a writing inconsistency. It's the core of his character, the tension that makes him so compelling. When Rick risks himself to save Morty or stands up to protect his family, we're seeing glimpses of the man he might have been before trauma and loss hardened him. These moments suggest that despite everything he's experienced, despite his nihilistic philosophy and self-destructive tendencies, some fundamental capacity for heroism remains intact within him. This reluctant heroism doesn't redeem Rick's many terrible actions, but it does complicate our understanding of his character, suggesting that beneath the cynicism lies something more complex than simple selfishness. While Rick's actions reveal his hidden capacity for heroism, his awareness of infinite dimensions creates an existential prison more confining than any the Galactic Federation could build. In a reality where every possible outcome exists simultaneously, Rick faces the ultimate paradox. Why should he care about anything when everything is meaningless? Yet why does he continue to care so deeply about specific people and outcomes? This contradiction forms the bedrock of Rick's character. The knowledge that sits in Rick's brain, that infinite realities exist where every possible scenario plays out, creates a burden most minds couldn't bear. When literally everything is possible somewhere in the multiverse, how can any single reality or relationship hold meaning? This isn't just a philosophical thought experiment for Rick, it's his daily reality. Every morning he wakes up knowing that somewhere, infinite other Ricks are making different choices, living different lives, and experiencing different outcomes. In Rick's Minutes, we see this philosophy in action when Rick introduces the family to interdimensional cable. He attempts to prove to Morty that all possible lives are equally meaningless by showing infinite alternate realities. His goal seems clear: to demonstrate that attachments are pointless in an infinite cosmos. But here's where the paradox emerges. Despite having access to literally infinite families across countless dimensions, Rick remains stubbornly tethered to this specific Smith family. The same man who can jump to any reality where he's welcomed by countless versions of his daughter chooses to stay with one particular Beth. The same scientist who could find a dimension where Jerry is tolerable, or even admirable, continues to antagonize this specific Jerry. And most tellingly, the same grandfather who could mentor any of infinite Mortys devotes himself to the development and protection of this Morty. These choices reveal the contradiction at Rick's core: his intellectual understanding of cosmic meaninglessness versus his emotional need for specific connections. This tension creates Rick's unique form of existential dread. Unlike ordinary humans who might worry about finding meaning in a single lifetime, Rick must grapple with finding meaning when infinity itself renders all choices simultaneously significant and meaningless. His nihilistic statements often function as a shield against this unbearable reality. When Rick tells Morty that nobody exists on purpose, nobody belongs anywhere, everybody's gonna die, he's not just being cynical, he's expressing a truth that his interdimensional awareness forces him to confront daily. Yet beneath these nihilistic pronouncements lies a desperate search for something that matters. We see this most clearly in Rick's creation of the central finite curve, a walled-off section of the multiverse containing only realities where Rick is the smartest being. This massive undertaking represents far more than ego. It's an attempt to impose order and hierarchy on a chaotic multiverse. By establishing boundaries and creating a system where certain realities are more important than others, Rick betrays his own nihilistic philosophy. He's essentially trying to create a framework where things can matter again, where distinctions have meaning, and where his own existence holds significance. The central finite curve isn't just a plot device. It's a physical manifestation of Rick's psychological need for structure amid existential chaos. Like a man building walls against an incoming tide, Rick desperately tries to create meaning by segregating realities into categories of significance. If the entire multiverse is too vast to hold meaning, perhaps a carefully curated section of it can still matter. This same pattern appears in Rick's relationships. Despite his claims that all connections are temporary and Meaningless in an infinite universe, Rick forms genuine bonds. He maintains a specific friendship with Bird Person across decades. He stays with a specific Beth, despite having infinite replacements available. And perhaps most significantly, he develops a unique, evolving partnership with his Morty. These relationships serve as anchors in the endless sea of possibility. Fixed points Rick uses to navigate an otherwise overwhelming multiverse. Rick's journey to find Rick Prime provides another window into this existential struggle. For decades, hunting his family's killer gave Rick purpose in a purposeless multiverse. The quest supplied a narrative to his existence, a beginning, the murder, a middle, the search, and an anticipated end, revenge. But when Rick finally achieves this goal in Season 7, the emptiness that follows reveals the fragility of this constructed meaning. Without his quest for vengeance, Rick must confront the question he's been avoiding. What now? In a universe where anything is possible and nothing inherently matters, what purpose can replace his decades-long mission? This moment of purposelessness after achieving revenge mirrors the philosophical dilemma at the heart of Rick's character. He understands better than anyone that in an infinite multiverse, all narratives are equally valid and equally meaningless. Yet he cannot help but crave a story that gives his specific existence meaning. The show's creators suggest that this struggle is what makes Rick such a compelling character. His nihilistic statements often mask a desperate search for meaning, creating a man who understands the meaninglessness of everything, yet desperately searches for something that matters. This complexity transforms Rick from a simple mad scientist into a character grappling with the fundamental questions of existence. What makes Rick's journey particularly fascinating is how it evolves over time. Despite his awareness that personal growth is just one path among infinite possibilities, Rick does change. He forms deeper connections with his family. He occasionally puts others' needs before his own. He reluctantly opens himself to vulnerability. These small evolutions suggest that even in a meaningless multiverse, personal growth and connection matter. Not because they hold objective cosmic significance, but because Rick chooses to give them significance. This may be the ultimate answer to Rick's existential paradox. In a universe without inherent meaning, we create meaning through our choices and connections. Rick demonstrates this truth even while verbally denying it. By choosing this specific family, by protecting this specific Morty, by fighting this specific battle, Rick assigns meaning to particular relationships and outcomes despite knowing infinite alternatives exist. Despite his incredible intelligence and awareness of the multiverse's meaninglessness, Rick finds purpose in his relationships, particularly with Morty. His willingness to engage in adventures and protect his grandson reveals that he finds meaning in this connection, even while struggling to acknowledge it openly. Every time Rick risks himself to save Morty, every time he chooses to return to the Smith family rather than find a more compatible version, he's making a profound philosophical statement. Some things can matter, even in an infinite cosmos. As we conclude our journey through Rick's complex psychology, it's worth noting how deeply fans have connected with his character over the years. What makes Rick so compelling isn't just his scientific brilliance or interdimensional adventures, but the very human struggles beneath his cynical exterior. Viewers have consistently responded to his evolution throughout the series, finding in his journey reflections of universal human struggles with meaning and connection. This resonance speaks to the show's remarkable achievement in crafting a character who, despite his extraordinary circumstances, remains profoundly relatable. Rick's relationship with Morty in particular has become a canvas for exploring how people confront their fears and traumas together, creating space for growth even in the most damaged individuals. The emotional depth woven into Rick's narrative has earned acclaim precisely because it allows us to see ourselves in his search for meaning. As you drift towards sleep, perhaps Rick's most meaningful adventure isn't hunting Rick Prime or exploring strange new worlds, but the internal journey we're all on, learning to connect with others despite our wounds, and finding purpose in a universe that often seems indifferent to our existence.